I'm glad you're here tonight. The series that we're starting tonight is called Family Matters. And the reason that I put this series together is when I first started learning about herbs, the first herb class that I went to, the person who was teaching it went through herbs alphabetically. Alfalfa is for, barberry is for, and by about burdock, I was sitting in my seat going, my brain is too tired, I can't remember all of this. And so I decided that when I started teaching my own classes, I was not going to do it that way. And so I started teaching a series of classes that were based on the body systems. And I would teach a class on the digestive system for 2 hours, or a class on... I was ready to give up and start without you, Leanne.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Chamber function.
Well, that's good.
Mr. Chair, okay. Oh, okay.
How are you? We ready? Okay, we're rolling. I'm glad you're here tonight. The series that we're starting tonight is called Family Matters. And the reason that I put this series together is when I first started learning about herbs, the first herb class that I went to, the person who was teaching it went through herbs alphabetically. Alfalfa is for, barberry is for, and by about burdock, I was sitting in my seat going, my brain is too tired, I can't remember all of this. And so I decided that when I started teaching my own classes, I was not going to do it that way. And so I started teaching a series of classes that were based on the body systems. And I would teach a class on the digestive system for 2 hours, or a class on the urinary system or the respiratory system. And that was a lot more effective because I found that people tended to remember what they heard because they had some kind of context to put it in, instead of hearing 19 different herbs that could be used for a cough at different points through the alphabet. And so that was an improvement. And that's the audio tape series that I have available. So if people are real concerned with their intestines, they can buy the intestinal tape and listen to 2 hours of that. And it helped a lot because we could put together some lifestyle things and diet information and a little bit of all different kinds of things that you could remember with the herbs, so that it wasn't just trying to find a fix for something. And this course is kind of the summation, I think, the neatest thing that we've ever done, because it's designed to help you be able to take care of your families without having to go through every possible system that you can think of to find out what's going on, without having to rearrange everything in your whole lives all at once, and without having to feel like you have to know it all, everything, before you're going to be able to do anything. And so I wanted to put things into a really basic format, and this is what we've come up with. So the first workshop, the one tonight that you're sitting in on, is called Wood Stoves and the Swamp Thing. And by the end of the night, that'll make some sense to you. Right now, it just sounded kind of catchy and cute. And it's basically the two analogies that I use with my clients to help them understand how their body's working and what goes wrong. And then we'll spend the last portion of the class figuring out what to do from there. Okay? When I first started talking about herbs and thinking about herbs, one of the first books that I read was called Back to Eden by a man named Jethro Kloss. And this was a book from the 1800s, and it's kind of the herb Bible for a lot of people that first start using herbs. Back in the 70s, when herbs started becoming prominent again, everybody had a copy of Back to Eden on their shelf. And Jethro Kloss had a solution for everything, and that was the high enema. And that just made no sense to me at all. I thought this guy has just got a fixation or something, And hopefully, as we get into this wood stove thing, you'll start to understand what we're talking about. I think that most people, when they start using herbs, they start using them medicinally. They have a problem, a flu, a bug, or something like that they want to deal with, and usually they've reached a last resort point. The drugs they've tried haven't worked, and so they want something different to see if that works. And I don't think that herbs work that way. I'll get into that a little bit more later, but basically what I try to teach my clients is that your body works just like a good old-fashioned pot-bellied wood stove. And if you've ever seen one of those stoves, cast iron, pig iron kind of thing, you know that there are three things that it has to have if it's going to work. And the very first thing that a wood stove has to have if it's going to function is a damper. You have to be able to let air circulate in that firebox, or you can't even get a fire to start. And the same thing's true in your body. You've got to have oxygen circulating in the body, or you die. You can't get a fire started without any oxygen in the body. And so we have to keep that going. And the quantity of oxygen available is definitely going to determine what kind of a fire you get, how effectively the fire burns. The second thing that you've got to have, and that's the biggest, bulkiest part of the wood stove, is the firebox. It's the part where you're going to put the fuel. And you're going to open the door up and stick some fuel in there and light the fire, give it a spark. We get that at birth. And then as long as you've got the oxygen there, you can keep that fire burning. Now, the kind of fuel that you put in that wood stove is going to determine the kind of fire that you get. If you've ever had a fireplace or a wood stove and you try to burn your Christmas tree after the season, you get a fire that is enormously smoky. It will just put soot out, it'll put smoke out. It may burn real hot and fast for a moment here and there when you get a pocket of pitch or some resin, but for the most part it burns at a very, very fast but low temperature. burns real quick, it's gone. You can't keep a long-term sustained fire going. But you do get a lot of smoke and a lot of soot in your chimney. Contrary to that, you try to burn something like hickory or oak, or really good solid hardwood, and you get a fire that burns at a very high temperature for a very long time, very sustained fire. And you get a fire that burns very clean. So you don't produce a lot of soot, and you don't produce a lot of smoke. That's the kind of fire or wood that you can make charcoal out of, because it just keeps burning and burning and burning and burning. And those are the kinds of foods that we want to have in our bodies. We can relate the fuel directly to the kind of fire that we want to have in our body. I had an 8-year-old in my office one day, and he liked to eat burgers. That was it. His mother said, he didn't eat anything other than hamburgers and French fries, and she didn't know what to do about it. So I figured an 8-year-old's reasonably intelligent and responsible. So I said, can you burn tires in a fireplace? And he looked at me like, only a mom could be stupid enough to ask a question like that. And he said, of course not. That is dumb. I said, you're right. It is dumb. Why can't you burn tires in a fireplace? He said, because you're not supposed to. You're supposed to burn wood. I said, you're right. And guess what you have to burn in your body? You have to burn fuel that your body can break down, okay? Now, we're going to talk a whole class on food, and I don't want to do a whole lot about it, but I want to give you some basic things you can do to get started. I believe that when your body was put together, it was put together the same way that the birds and the beasts and the flowers and the trees were put together. And so your body knows inherently how to communicate with those things. It understands their language, if you will. And so when you take a bird or a beast or a flower into your body can figure out what to do with it. And it breaks it all down and uses all the right parts and pieces, and it makes you energy, okay? When you take something in that was man-made, something synthetic, the body doesn't quite get the whole message. It understands it sort of, but there are missing pieces because it's not in the same language. They don't communicate completely. And so you tend to have these leftover pieces and parts that you can't do anything with. When I really understood that was when I had a computer problem. I got my computer and I was really excited because I had a computer and I could put together a really professional looking newsletter. And so I did this great newsletter on my computer, and I had columns and headlines and just this great, really nice looking newsletter. And I pushed print, and what came out was the right words, but they were all the same size. My headlines had disappeared. So I called my computer whiz friend and said, Richard, what did I do wrong? My computer is mad at me or something. It's not giving me the right message. And he says, it's no real problem. You didn't do anything wrong. You just probably have an interface that hasn't been installed. And so your computer doesn't get the detail part of the message that says, oh yeah, by the way, make these words bigger, meaning my headlines. And so we fixed that, and my headlines came out okay after that. And to me, that's exactly the way your body is working. When you're taking in something that's synthetic, there's this little interface missing because we weren't programmed for man-made food. And so we can pretty much get parts of the pieces out of the food, but we can't get the whole message. And there are going to be those little detail things left over, and that begins to be a stress to the body. We'll talk more and more about stresses, but your body just becomes tired trying to break something down that it just doesn't know how. And so that's why we want to stick to foods that were created, foods that are natural in their form. When we talk about the kinds of foods, I disagree or differ with some of the prominent authorities at the moment. This is 1995 in the spring. And I'd like to tell you why I feel really comfortable doing that, okay? When I was 11 years old, I was diagnosed with osteoporosis. I broke 3 bones in 5 months or so. Well, I broke my arm, in fact, twice, once through a cast before it got healed the first time. And so I went to medical experts and everybody, and they said, yes, you have osteoporosis. And osteoporosis is also, it's an old lady's disease, and we call it brittle bone disease. And what that means is that you have too much calcium in your bones, and it makes your bones really brittle. And so you shouldn't have a lot of calcium. So I was told that I should, watch my milk intake, which wasn't a problem. I didn't like it anyway. But I should limit those kinds of things in my diet at this point. Now I ended up even going to Johns Hopkins University Hospital to talk with the experts there in the course of this investigation. So these were very prominent medical theories at the time. And that was 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago. And today, what are they telling us about osteoporosis? You got too much calcium in your bones, that's making them brittle, and the reason you have all that calcium stuck in your bones is because you have too little calcium in the whole body and your bones are hoarding it. So add lots and lots and lots of calcium. Now we have a 180-degree difference here between the top medical experts. 25 years ago or 23 years ago, whatever, they were saying, oh, too much calcium, stay away, and now they're saying, too little calcium, get it in quick. All right? I think hopefully in another 10 years they'll figure out the real fact, which is that calcium has nothing to do with osteoporosis. It's a magnesium deficiency. Magnesium is what keeps that calcium from locking up into the bones and moving through the body the way that it's supposed to be. So that's why I feel really comfortable saying things that might not be really fashionable. We tend in the health industry and in the medical profession to go through these cycles. And we have, the herb of the month, or the super vitamin that everybody needs to take, or the magic cure for everybody. And we do the same thing with diet, and from the medical standpoint, usually it's a no, everybody should stay away from, and nobody should ever partake of. And we get these things that we shouldn't eat. And usually medical science comes out wrong. They are really wonderful people, but they have a couple of failings that I see, one being that they think that they know everything. And I think that if any time we ever reach the point where we think we know everything, we probably are ready for a fall, because we're going to find out that we really don't know everything. And so, they said, okay, everybody needs more calcium, and then they said, or no, nobody needs calcium, you need too little calcium, and then they said, oops, no, sorry, now we know we're right, and we need more calcium, and they knew they were right then. Does that, to anybody else, seem a little bit like that happens? Well, with the diet things, we tend to go in the same kind of cycles, right? People start saying first, no eggs. Egg yolks are high in cholesterol, they will kill you. The fact that your great-grandparents ate dozens and dozens of eggs and never had cholesterol problems doesn't enter into the picture, but egg yolks are really high in cholesterol, nobody should eat them. And that's true, egg yolks are very high in cholesterol. But now they've come up with other studies, and they say very quietly, well, yes, but egg whites are pure lecithin, and lecithin dissolves cholesterol in the bloodstream, and so you've never yet seen an egg yolk come out of a shell. It's always got this white around it, and so the whole egg maybe isn't a problem after all. And the same thing's true with butter, right? 2 years ago, nobody should ever eat butter. Butter would kill you. Butter had too much cholesterol in it. The study that was done last summer said, but if you eat margarine, it causes you to produce trans fatty acids trying to break the margarine down, and so you end up with more cholesterol being produced than is in the butter to begin with. So don't eat butter or margarine is the answer. We should all eat nothing, right? Cardboard and artificial everything. And so those are the kinds of things that I try to stay away from, are those kind of fads in the diet. I believe that when we were put on the earth and God said it's good and everything that we needed was here and it was good, that he meant it. It was not good enough till we figured out something better. And so I believe that we need to be eating our foods the way they were made. The rule at my house for my kids for snacks is if it's the way it grew, you don't have to ask. So they can help themselves to radishes, carrots, oranges, apples, but they have to ask before they can get even an organic whole wheat cracker. And that works for us. So the more raw foods that we take in, the better. With this wood stove, the kinds of foods that would compare to a pine tree are things like your sugars, your very refined starches and sugars, because what do they do for your energy level? They burn short and they burn sooty. You end up with a lot of waste matter, a lot of unprocessed matter. That's why people go through this kind of a cycle with sugar, right? You take your Snickers bar, you hit the ceiling, and you bottom. Excuse me. So that's the kind of thing that we want to avoid, that short-burning, soot-producing energy that we tend to get from those kinds of foods. Okay, now on the side of the hickory or the oak, we have those foods that tend to hold their heat in the body. What does an athlete do the night before a competition? It's a classic runner's dinner. Carbohydrates, okay? Why? Because carbohydrates in the body burn at a very slow, even pace. Have any of you ever had a baked potato? What happens to a baked potato? Do you know that people used to use baked potatoes for hand warmers? They would bake potatoes and they would stick them inside their muffs, and they would hold the heat for a long period of time. Now, if you put out a piece of broccoli and a baked potato at the same time on your plate, in 2 minutes that broccoli's already cooled down, but what's happened to the potato? It holds the heat very, very well. And it does the same thing inside of the body. It burns at a very, very slow, even temperature. And that's why the carbohydrates in the body tend to be the best sustained energy foods, and why so many people believe we should base our diet mostly on grains. Whole grains are very slow-burning, steady-burning carbohydrates. And we keep that energy for a long period of time. And so with that fuel, you have the choice. Do you want to burn something that's going to burn short and sweet? The expression even fits. Or something that's going to burn with some substance and give you some long-term, long-duration energy. So that's where you come back to the kinds of foods. Eat something that's natural, that's natural not on the label because that means nothing, okay? But something that was actually designed for your body to use. Eat foods in their natural form, in their whole form, the way that they were created and put together for us to eat. and eat a variety of foods. Now, those are basic things that everybody can do. Simple steps that most people can take to get that wood stove fuel a whole lot better are things like eliminating iceberg lettuce. That's the highest plant in pesticides in your supermarket, according to a number of different studies, and it's the lowest plant in nutrition. That's why it's white. The color of a vegetable shows you its mineral content. And so we have almost no minerals in iceberg lettuce. That's why people usually eat vegetables, is for minerals. So you can do something that simple. Change that. You can do simple things like starting to eat foods in their season. And those are some good basic steps that everybody can make. Another basic one that everybody can do is to try to add a new vegetable every week or a new fruit. I've heard it said that the average supermarket stocks 200 different vegetables and the average American eats 7. So we eat the same ones over and over and over again rather than expanding the variety. So those are some basic steps that everybody can take. And everyone can eat more raw food. The importance of that we'll discuss at another time, but it just does increase the enzyme level, and it does really help the body to function at a lot cleaner level. A nice, clean chimney, nice, clean fire is going to burn from raw foods. All right, now the second thing, or the third thing actually, that any wood stove is going to have is a chimney. You've got to have some means for that smoke to be eliminated after it's been produced in the fire. And if you come along in a chimney and plug it up, you only have two possibilities. If you've got a wood stove with a good roaring fire, a great blaze, and you plug up the chimney, what's going to be your result? It'll blow up. If it is a good roaring blaze, it'll blow the chimney off, it'll blow the blockage out of the chimney, it'll blow off the door, but somehow or other, you're going to find a way for that stuff to leave the body or leave the firebox, okay? And in our bodies, the comparative thing we would do would be getting sick. That's what we would call being sick. We vomit. We throw up. We get a rash. We get diarrhea. We get a fever. Somehow or other, the body starts trying to force stuff out of a chimney because the main chimney's plugged. The other possibility that you have, if you've got a wood stove and a good fire going, or a fire in there that's not going so well, just sort of smoldering along with a lot of smoke and so forth, and you plug up the chimney, then your fire definitely will go out. The fire will just suffocate in its own smoke. That's, in our culture, what we would call a type B personality, okay? Type A people do what? They get heart attacks, strokes, they get sick, big time, noticeably. Type B people are the people that go for their retirement physicals, having never missed a day of work in their life, and the guy says, I hate to tell you, but you've got 5 weeks to live, right? And everybody says, my goodness, he was never sick, and they were right. Nothing ever came out. This person kept everything inside the body. Nothing ever left, and so basically you had an implosion instead of an explosion. The body just stored and suffocated and suppressed everything for years and years and years. And there should, for most of us, be a healthy balance. Now, what do you do if you've got a wood stove and you've got a chimney getting plugged up? If it's a fireplace or something, you call in a chimney sweep, or you get out the flue brush and you go up inside the chimney and you clean out whatever's blocking it. Well, in your body, you have 4 chimneys. Probably it was known that we would foul up at least one. But the first chimney that everybody has is the bowel. And this is where Jethro Kloss suddenly made sense to me. The man didn't have a fixation. He understood how the body was working, okay? The first chimney is the bowel in every case. Now, Harvard Medical School says that normal bowel elimination is a bowel movement for every meal that you consume, which means that most people in America should be going to the bathroom 2 or 3 times a day. The first time I said that in a class, I had one woman sit there and look at me and say, I will spend my whole life in the bathroom. And, you know, for her it was a very lengthy, time-consuming, difficult process. And it's interesting to me when I started thinking about that my grandfather, who died of diverticulitis and liver cancer and so forth, very suppressed colon and intestinal system, I can remember that the tradition was after dinner he would go up into the bathroom in their house, and he would be there for ages and ages and ages. His eliminative system just didn't work. They did an autopsy study a few years ago in California. They wanted to find the state of the average American colon. And so they took automobile accident victims in Los Angeles County. Okay? Now you figure an automobile accident victim is about as random as you could get, right? So they did these autopsies. This is the story Dr. Jack Richardson was telling. And he said that they did these autopsies and they found out that they literally had to use hacksaws to get into a lot of these colons, and that the average American had 23 pounds of impacted fecal matter lining the intestinal wall. Now, I thought that was really funny because if you would ask most people on the street if they'd like to lose weight, they would say yes. And if you said, how much weight would you like to lose, they would all say, oh, about 20 pounds. So we found it. That missing 20 pounds that everybody's waiting to find to get rid of is right in the colon. They just have to get that chimney opened up. So they also found in that study, though, scarily, that 80% of those people were either cancerous or had precancerous areas in the colon. And so we understand why we're getting more and more and more people in America doing that, and why recently one of the medical journals, or Surgeon General, said that up to 68% of the cancers and diseases and causes of death in America were diet-related. So we've got this 23 pounds sitting here. We've got this 80% matter, cancerous, precancerous areas in the colon. That's a pretty scary figure. And I don't think that it means we need to get panicky. The first thing that everybody can do for that is just what we talked about in the chimney. Get more raw foods in there. Get more whole foods in there. And those kinds of things. Start to scrub and move stuff along. I was at a cookware demonstration one night, and a man was talking about different health foods and so forth. And he says, you know, people used to make flour and water and use it, or mix flour and water and use it for wallpaper paste. And he says, and then we wonder why people get constipated. And the sediment built up in many cases simply because of the types of foods that we've been eating for long, long periods of time. I have to tell you that this lady that said she would spend her whole life in the bathroom did start using some things to strengthen the colon muscle and so forth. And she called me up about 3 weeks later. I got some really, really interesting phone calls. And this lady did not identify herself. So I got on the phone and she said, Karen, I know why they call it a movement now. I mean, it just moves. It starts at one end and it just moves, and that's all. And it only takes a couple of minutes. You're right, and I'm thrilled for you, but who is this? And that's what had happened in her body. What most people don't remember or realize about the colon is that it is a muscle. All right? It's an actual muscle, and it's one of the muscles that's called a round muscle that's almost identical in structure to the esophagus. And the round muscles in the body work on a contract, relax motion. It's like a ripple that starts at one end, and like she said, it's a movement, singular. It starts at one end, and it ripples on around, and it's over. A movement to clear the colon. Okay? Somebody asked in the break, well, how can, you know, if you're all plugged up, how can stuff still keep going through? Well, the colon is large enough and has lots of little pockets all along it. Those are the diverticuli. So when you hear about people having diverticulitis, itis means inflammation of. And so it means those little pockets are all inflamed and hot and sore and swollen. And if you hear somebody saying diverticulosis, it means that they're not moving, they're not doing anything, so you've got slow, dead pockets rather than hot, sore pockets. Now, because it's a muscle, it can be strengthened, just like you can strengthen or build any other muscle in the body. And that's what needs to happen. Now, the best-selling, this shocked me, the best-selling class of over-the-counter medications in our country is laxatives. We actually sell more laxatives than allergy remedies and diet pills in this country, okay? And so it's sort of the national pastime to just assume they have to do this. But a laxative does exactly what it says. It relaxes. So what happens is you've got this muscle that's full of stuff impacted all along the walls, and you come in with a laxative and the muscle goes, limp. And so whatever's loose and available goes limp right on out of the body, and that's why people have to do this right now. You know, they can't wait, they can't control the muscle the way that you would control other muscles. There is only one herb that has that kind of an effect and is a habit-forming herb, and that's called senna. And it's sad because the only herb I've ever heard a doctor recommend was senna. And senna is one of the herbs that you want to use in a very, very cautious way because the body should not have to become dependent on anything. And the reason it becomes dependent on a laxative is that whole principle of if anything that's in rest is going to remain at rest unless moved upon by an outside force. Remember the old law of inertia? Well, if you've got this muscle that's all limp and you're not expecting it to do anything, it doesn't. It atrophies. It stops working. And so you have to come in with another laxative so it goes again. And that's why you get into this cycle over and over of having to use the laxatives. So what we want to do instead is to try to build that muscle up. And herbs will help with that because they are foods that are help to gear the muscle. People can also do colon massage. Women who've had several children, especially a woman who's had a hysterectomy, will tend to find that this part of the colon will collapse. Gravity gets in the way, and so when there's no longer a uterus to hold that transverse colon in position, it kind of tends to get a little lazy. And that's why a lot of women will get very constipated after having hysterectomies. It's because you've got a really strong muscle action here to get the fecal matter up the colon, but then it can't always have enough oomph to go down and up again in an M shape before it leaves. It should be able to go up and straight across. And so sometimes just lying with your hips elevated and massaging upward helps to get that colon back into position. Now, the caution that I would want to put in here is that everybody immediately says, oh, cool, I'm going to go out and do some heavy colon cleansing. You know, we're going to rush this thing through. And there is definitely a place for that. I do encourage a lot of my clients to do some cleansing. But I think that for most of us, we need to find a balance. And the balance between building and cleansing is very important. Too many people, when they start using herbs, the first thing they think of is we've got to do heavy cleansing. Someone asked earlier about colonics. Is the only way to get rid of all this impacted stuff from colonics? And I don't believe that it is, because remember, with these pockets, if you take a colonic and you will scrub it out, because with the colonic you're using water under pressure, if you've got these pockets, and even if you scrub them out very fully, what's going to happen the next day to those pockets if that muscle still isn't working? You're going to start building sediment up again in these pockets. You need that ripple motion to squeeze those pockets and force that matter to leave. And so colonics, while they may be helpful for some people, and I think, again, need to be balanced with building, you need to be putting back in the other things that the colonic will take out. I don't think that most people need to focus heavily on cleansing. I had a client come in to me. This is someone who owns a health food store who has come to my classes and sent me clients for years, but never came in for a private consultation herself. And so she finally came in one day and threw herself in the chair and she says, okay, I give up. Just do whatever to me, because I've done every cleanse in my store for the last 2 years and I still don't have any energy. And so I looked at her and I said, okay, Carol, did you ever use Drano in your sink? And she said, well, sure, you know, when it gets real clogged up. I said, okay, what would happen if you used Drano every day in your sink? She said, I don't know, probably rust the pipes out. You got it. This is what's been happening. So many people start cleansing and cleansing and cleansing and cleansing, and they cleanse the body of a lot of toxic matter, and they cleanse the body of all the trace minerals, and they cleanse and they cleanse, and they are exhausted. And so it's kind of like pouring water into your bathtub, you know, to scrub it and scrub it and scrub it. You scrub the enamel off, but you just keep flushing it on through and never putting anything back in. And so for most people, and it's fun because when I do private consultations, almost invariably it comes out to this ratio, I always would try to recommend or suggest that people use at least 2 building combinations for every cleanser that they're using, so that you just don't go in and roto-root and flush forever, but that you get to the root of the problem. Because why is that stuff in there? It's largely diet, but it's this deficient minerals that's not giving the muscle tone and so forth. So you want to try to strengthen the muscles. Make that chimney really do its job and get rid of everything there. Now, the second chimney that everyone has is the urinary system. And that system, most people think, is there to get rid of fluid, to flush out all that extra water. And that's really not even the whole truth. The kidneys are really designed to hold on to water. Their job is to keep enough fluid circulating in the body to keep you safe. They want to keep the dissolved waste matter and so forth in the bloodstream and in the body fluids at a level that is not going to be extremely taxing to the heart and to the kidneys. And so when you become very toxic, the body will hold on to more fluid because it keeps you safe. Imagine the analogy of if you were to make a pot of soup too salty, what would you do? You would make a bigger pot of soup, right? Or tea that's too strong, you make a bigger pot of tea. You just always would dilute that matter, which is exactly what your kidneys are trying to do for you when you hold on to fluid. So what do we do for that? We take a diuretic. We say, forget it, kidneys, we don't want you doing this to us. Force it through. Drain it on down. And so what happens? You increase the strain on the kidneys even more. You're making them do even more than they wanted to do, so they get even. And they come right back at you with, okay, I'll make it even bigger this time, I dare you. And that's why people get into these cycles with the diuretics. You start, you use them, you have to keep using them and keep using them and keep using them. And people get into a cycle with that. The first thing everybody can do for that chimney is just to start drinking water. It's a very novel thought. In our culture, in our country right now, most people's water tastes so terrible that nobody likes to drink water anymore. We're going to talk a lot more about water in one of the later classes, so I don't want to do a whole lot today, but most people do need to be drinking a lot more water. And what they don't realize is that the amount of water that they have to consume is water, not other fluids. The best guideline I have heard for how much water to drink is to take your body weight in pounds, divide it by 2, and that's how many ounces you should have in a day. So if you weigh 120 pounds, you should be having 60 ounces of water in a day. That's how much water you need just to have the body normally able to flush the metabolic wastes that you're going to produce in a given day. That's not to deal with the Diet Coke that you had for lunch, which is going to increase the stress. That's not to break down a lot of other matter. That's not to replace what you use up in the garden in Florida in August. That's just to process the normal metabolic wastes of a normal everyday situation. And so if you're using those substances like the Diet Cokes or whatever, and I hope Coke doesn't sue me, I'm not picking on them personally, a diet soft drink. If you're doing things like that, then you've got to have extra water even to compensate for that. And most people use their thirst as a judge. And most people are not going to feel thirsty until you're down at least a quart of body fluid. And so that's not a good indicator at all that you need a glass of water, because what do? You don't go drink a quart when you feel a little bit thirsty. I suggest that most people would do best if they would, if nothing else, drink a really large glass of water right before they went to bed at night, and drink another really large glass of water as soon as they got up in the morning. And that way everybody would at least have 2 good glasses of water a day, because I bet you there are people in this room who don't do that. You maybe drink something to chase your lunch down, but most of us get too busy and just don't make a point of drinking all the time. That water also incidentally needs to be at body or room temperature in order to be able to do that filtering job, because when you're drinking it very, very cold, the body will contract and it will need even more of the water than it would need otherwise. So that's the first thing that most people can do. If you're drinking with your meals and drinking water, I suggest that you add some lemon juice. And that's a good way to acidify that water so it doesn't interfere with your digestion. The lemon juice is also a good cleanser, helps to tighten the liver up a little bit, so it's something that would be beneficial to most people anytime to increase that. That's a simple thing that everybody can do. So for the first thing, for the fuel, you're going to start eating more raw foods, right, and try a new food every week to increase your fuel or improve your fuel situation. You could start breathing. That's a novel thought, to increase that oxygen content, Actually breathe like with your whole body. Instead of going only when you get real nervous. So start breathing, and you've already solved or improved your first step of your wood stove. Start increasing the raw foods and add a new food every now and then, and you've increased or improved the fuel situation. We've talked about that raw food also improving your chimney situation with the first chimney. Now your second chimney, you just have to add a couple glasses of water a day, okay? The third chimney that everyone has is the skin. And people don't usually think of the skin as an organ. They asked a little class one time of 3rd or 4th graders to define, various body systems and organs. And when one of the kids was asked what the skin was for, he said it was the covering that you had on your body so that people didn't gross out when they saw your bones and muscles and stuff. And that's how most of us think of it. It's just sort of this cover stuff that we take for granted. But it's the largest excretory organ that you have. It's actually an organ, and it's pumping out. Do any of you remember the James Bond Goldfinger movie? And where people were dying because they were being gold-leafed, right? Dipped. And so they stopped having respiration through the skin, and that was enough to kill them. We've got to have free respiration through the skin, and that's probably the one that we abuse the most in our society, because people used to wear very coarse clothing, so that was taking off dead skin cells. They used to work in the dirt with their hands. They used lye, soap, and scrub brushes, and they never had a dead skin cell on the surface of their bodies. We have everything very soft, and it feels wonderful. I love my soft cottons, and I wouldn't trade them for anything else. But it doesn't give us that same kind of effect, so we have to take an extra step for getting that circulation improved and getting the skin sloughed off. A lot of women do it on their face. They'll use a peel or something on their face to get that skin off, but we don't do it on the rest of the body. So I suggest that first, something very simple and inexpensive everybody can do at home just to get that chimney operating is to get either a bath brush or a loofah or even a really coarse cloth and scrub your body really well before you get in the shower. It's called the dry brushing technique. And the purpose of dry brushing is to increase the circulation and to slough off the dead skin cells before you get in the shower, because at that point then you're going to be able to begin excreting, leaving waste matter out of the body, and the water will wash that off. What most people do instead is they jump into a shower, they use a mineral oil product, some kind of a petroleum-based soap, which is byproducts of the petroleum industry. When they process gasoline, what's left over is what they make soap and detergent and stuff out of. And they scrub their bodies with it, and they totally seal that skin off. So you rinse off the superficial dirt, and basically you seal the skin at that point. And some people find that if they take a shower, a really quick shower, when they get out of the shower, they start to perspire, and they get a body odor, like 5 minutes after the shower. And what's happened is that they scrubbed enough in the shower to stimulate a little bit of a cleanse, but they're already out of the shower by the time that happens. And if they weren't quick enough with the aluminum to stop everything up, it comes out. And suddenly they're saying, boy, I need another shower already, and it's only been 5 minutes. And so we want to get that stuff organized and moving out of the body before we get in there. So that when we're in there and we're scrubbing off with our non-mineral based soap, okay, we want a glycerin-based soap or a coconut soap or something that's got something in it that's not going to be a mineral oil, which totally seals the skin, we're going to actually have an excretory function happening while we're in the shower. And you've doubled or tripled or quadrupled the value of that bath just by scrubbing off before you get in there. And the people that have all the buildup on the feet and the elbows and stuff of all the dead skin and it gets really dry, that will probably not happen. Because not only are you going to be sloughing off the superficial dead skin, but by increasing the circulation, you're going to increase the rate at which the body renews those cells. And so you're not going to have as many problems with the calluses and the dry, dead, flaky skin on the joint ends and so forth that you would have if you were not doing that before. So that's a simple way to make that chimney really work well for you. The third or fourth chimney, the last chimney that everyone has, is the mucous membranes in the body. And those are the membranes that line not only the digestive system, but the respiratory tract. Now, that's what people get when they say they've got allergies. Okay? Now, I don't believe in diseases, and I probably should say here and in every tape that I am not here to diagnose diseases or to prescribe for diseases. I'm here to teach information about your bodies. And you have the constitutional right and the responsibility to take whatever you learn here and apply it in your own lives however you see fit. Okay, I'm not here to replace a doctor. I don't think that's necessary. But I am here to help you get your bodies working. And people who say they have allergies, which is basically a body that's hyperreactive to something. It's a body that's under so much stress that one piece of strawberry or one piece of pollen is more than it can handle, thank you, and it tries to get rid of it really fast. So you sneeze, your eyes water, you throw up, you get a rash, something. What happens? Those chimneys, do you see? Start opening up wide, trying to find the closest out for the stuff that it's not supposed to be having. And so that's where your last resort chimney is located, right up here. You will never have those chimneys back up in any other order. They will always back up, starting with the bowel and moving to the kidneys and to the skin and to the mucous membranes. And if you think back, if you get a cold, check back 2 days and your bowels will have slowed down, at least 2 days prior to that. Your urine will have been more concentrated. You might have been itchy, you might have been dry, you might have just sort of felt blah, which is that lack of circulation, before you catch the cold and have those symptoms starting up there. I had the first people outside of my home that I ever worked with were a family where two of the little girls, they were 3 and 5 at the time, had asthma. And they had asthma severe enough that at the time the mother had gone through 5 months of having one or the other of the children in the hospital for a week every month for 5 months. And so I had only ever worked with my own family at that point. And I went up to her, and they were using inhalants and steroids at that point. And, at 3 and 5, when you're using inhalants and steroids, there's really not a whole lot to do beyond that. And I said, you're going to think I'm really crazy, but did you ever think about trying herbs? I didn't know at the time she was a registered nurse, or I probably never would have said anything to her. But she kind of threw up her hands. She said, I'll try anything. At this point, what else do I have to lose? And so I started to just suggest some things from what I had heard and read and so forth to work with her little girls. And what was interesting was that everything we were using, with only one exception, was really for the liver and for the bowels. And not a lot of herbs for asthma, things that, an herbal therapist might say, this is it for this asthma or this condition if you were treating the disease. But we started doing that. In 3 weeks, those little girls had no more symptoms. And after about 5 months, they were using very, very minimal amounts of supplementation, but their diet had improved, their bowels had opened up, and yes, these 2 little girls had been constipated since they were born, and they'd had colic since they were born, and they'd had all these other problems backing up those other chimneys. And once the body started to work effectively, it didn't have to panic anymore. And they didn't have all these wild symptoms. And that was about 8 years ago, not 10, 12 years ago now. And those little girls have never had a relapse. And so after 5 years of dealing with this, to go 10 years without having to deal with it anymore, I think is remarkable. And again, I'm saying this is not because we treated the asthma, because we didn't. We just helped those little girls' bodies start to work, and we got those chimneys opened up, and suddenly the symptoms disappeared. And that's where we end the wood stove and we start moving into the swamp thing. I want to tell you the story of how I started with herbs. Most people start with herbs because they've tried everything else. Now that's changing a little bit. It was fun. I was talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago, and I said it's neat because my clientele, 10 years ago, the people that I saw were either totally desperate or a little on the fringe to begin with, and now I'm getting people that are mainstream, very average, middle American, housewife, nurse, doctor, middle-class bankers type people coming and saying, hey, do you have any of that echinacea stuff? I read an article about it, and it's, oh, echinacea, yeah, I can do that. So it's become, we've improved our awareness and our education level has gone up and people are starting to take some responsibility back for their own health. Well, that wasn't the case about 13 years ago when, or 11 years ago when my oldest son, who's 13 and a half right now, was 2 and a half. Now, I played with herbs. I thought herbs were kind of cool, and when I went to college, whenever I started getting a cold, I would go eat the hottest Chinese food I could find, hot and sour soup, very hot, very spicy, and they would always believe I didn't want it as hot as I did, and so I'd keep adding more stuff, and I'd get everything running. Well, that's using red pepper, basically, to stimulate, and garlic, and, and I played with it a little bit, but I wanted to be a good mom, and so I was taking my kid to the doctor, and we were doing the, the immunizations, and we were doing all the things that you're supposed to do. My oldest son is Micah. He's 13 and a half right now, and when Micah was about 2 and a half, we had gone through 2 years almost of chronic sinus infections, respiratory infections, ear infections, throat infections, everything from here up. He got a viral pneumonia when he was 8 months old and just sort of never really got better. And so we were back and forth with antibiotics all of the time, and when he was 2 and a half, he got one infection that was really severe. And so the pediatrician, because he'd had so many for so long, said, well, let's try this new medication, which was Ceclor. At the time, that was the next penicillin, the new ultimate wonder drug for everything. And so we put Mike on the Ceclor, and about 4 days into the Ceclor, we finally took him off. The doctor agreed that he was having an allergic reaction to the dye in the Ceclor. Now, it took a while to get that to happen, to get the admission that that's what was going on. After about 2 days, Micah started acting weird. I mean, there was no other word for it. This is my pleasant 2-year-old, and you would have to know my child now. Even at 13 and a half, he is most days a model child. And he was just really great, and all of a sudden he was walking across the living room, and he would just stop and start screaming at the top of his lungs in this rage. And this was just not like Micah, And I was that evening sitting and reading him a story, and he turned around and he started just pounding on me, just out of the blue, This was not my child. And so I called the doctor's office, and I said, something is really wrong with my child. He's acting really, really weird, And he says, oh, well, you're still a young mother, and 2-year-olds are like that, and he just doesn't feel good. I said, no, this isn't that he doesn't feel good. This is something weird. And so the next night, I missed a dose of his medicine. And I didn't even think about it. I was sitting on the couch, and I was reading him a story, and everything was wonderful. And I was thinking to myself, oh, the doctor was right. He just didn't feel good. He's feeling so much better. And a little while later, I remembered I hadn't given him the medicine, and I gave him the medication. And 20 minutes later, Micah was off the walls again. And so it was about 10 o'clock at night, and I called a pharmacist and said, is it possible that my child is having an allergic reaction to this medication? Or could the medication be causing this reaction? And he says, oh, is it? And he named 4 drugs, one of which was Ceclor. And he said, that's a real common reaction. That's got a real high dye load. And so it's a normal reaction to red dyes. So just see if the doctor would mind switching him to this one, or I don't remember what all the other ones were. So we did switch the medication, and we went from the bright purple Ceclor down to something that was a little pink, it was a little milder. And so we did 10 days of that one, and then we did 10 days of amoxicillin, and he still had a green, yucky nose. This was 23 days now of antibiotics. And I went back to the pediatrician, and he said, well, let's try one more course of antibiotics. And when I walked out of that office with the slip in my hand, I just said, no, let's not. If it has not worked in 23 days, it is not going to work. I quit. There's got to be a better way. And so I called a friend of mine who had used some herbs, and I played with some herbs, and I looked up some books and so forth, and I started using garlic and a combination that of herbs specifically for the sinus, and another combination that helped to stimulate the lymphatic and immune systems. And 3 days, Micah was clear, totally clear. And everybody said, hey, those antibiotics finally kicked in. Okay, but he was better. And so I stopped giving him the herbs. Next morning, Micah woke up green and yucky again in the nose and the eyes, the whole business. So I put him back on the herbs. And I thought, okay, well, you take your herbs or your drugs for 2 weeks, 10 days. I just didn't keep him on them long enough. He needs to be on his herbs for 10 days. After all, that's just a substitute for antibiotics anyway. I'm giving him, garlic and alfalfa instead of amoxicillin. And so I took him off the herbs after 10 days, and sure enough, that lasted for about 3 days before he started to get stuffy again. Now, Micah did not ever get infected again. I put him back on the herbs right away. Micah has never been back to a doctor for an illness since that time. So we've got 11 years last month of being doctor-free with my children. He had to go back once for a broken arm, and he's gone back to check a pulled groin muscle that was very serious, and his testicle had ascended, and I just wanted somebody else to say, yes, you will have grandchildren. And he had to get a Boy Scout physical for summer camp, and every time they've had to pull his records out of microfilm. You know, they think that he must have moved or died because nobody can go 7 years without seeing a doctor, which is how long the first interim was. But what I didn't understand about herbs at that point is what most people, I think, still don't understand about herbs, and that is that herbs are not substitutes for drugs. And so when I made my little disclaimer a while ago about not trying to treat a disease, I wasn't just doing that to keep myself from being nailed by the FDA. I really and truly believe that herbs are not substitutes for drugs. To me, that would be at best a cheap imitation. A drug is a cheap imitation of what an herb can do. The approach that we have to medicine in our country, or to health in our country, is you wait until something breaks, and then you go in and you do something to it. It's kind of like a top-down approach, okay? And I don't think that we were designed to work that way. I don't think that we wait until people go out and rape children before we start dealing with pornography, child pornography. Do you agree with that? We want to get down to what's causing this problem and prevent it, rather than trying to come in from the top after the fact and build more prisons for juvenile rapists, okay? And I think that that's kind of where we've maybe gotten off track a little bit with medicine, is that we're trying always to fix problems. Now, what herbs do is build the body, and herbs also work energetically. A drug has two capacities. Any medication can do one of two things. It can suppress a body function. When you hurt something, the body doesn't want you moving it a lot, so it will swell it up. Remember that kidney thing that we talked about? You want more fluid there. It helps to break that matter loose. It also keeps you from moving something that's injured a lot. So it's a safety mechanism. And what do? We give you an anti-inflammatory medication to take the swelling out so that you can move it again. And granted, that's more comfortable and more fun, but we're overriding something the body has done. Generally, the body does everything for a reason. No matter what it's doing it for some reason. It's not just this thing that operates by whim, but it thinks things through and it understands what we need. So it can suppress that. People have drugs right now that are suppressing body functions with assimilation of certain minerals and so forth. They have drugs that will suppress swelling. The best one that we're all familiar with is suppressing pain, right? We get a headache, and so we take something to keep us from hurting. Now, the reason probably that we even have the potential in our culture today for these Excedrin headaches is because none of us have tonsils anymore, and the tonsils produced the interferon that helped the body deal with pain. But all that aside, we're conditioned to believe that if you have a problem, you shouldn't have to feel it. And so we cut that out. When I was about, 25, I was injured on a job that I worked at. And they took me to the hospital. It was a back injury. And they said, now, because, we have to move you around a lot to x-ray you, and we know you're in a lot of pain, we're going to give you just a little shot of Demerol just to relax you enough that this doesn't hurt you a lot when we try to manipulate you. Well, having this very pristine system, I hadn't had an aspirin for 10 years, and we're talking about no caffeine, no alcohol, no sugar, That little teeny shot of Demerol was enough to throw me completely unconscious. So the next thing I knew, I was laying there, and they're saying, do you know where you are? Can you tell us your name? Trying to bring me back conscious again. But what I remember most is as they were wheeling me into x-ray, laying there thinking, wow, this really hurts. It didn't block that pain at all. It just blocked my ability to care that it hurt. And so that's what's happening. We may block the caring about the hurt. We may prevent the brain from receiving the hurt message. But even with the pain suppression, we've got that coming in again, okay? There's a reason for the pain. The pain is telling you something is wrong somewhere. And suppressing the pain is not solving the problem. The second capacity that any drug can have is the capacity to imitate some aspect of body function. And I've chosen that word carefully because I do not believe that man has the capacity to duplicate anything in the body. And so we can do an imitation. We can take something like insulin or something like a hormone, progesterone or something, and we can say, okay, here's a synthetic version of progesterone, and we can give it to the body. I don't believe that man has sufficient wisdom to make a perfect duplicate of anything that's been created. And so there are always going to be some kind of side effects. Remember those detail messages, those interfaces that weren't installed in my computer, that are going to leave leftover bits and pieces unbroken down. And we also, because we don't understand anything in the body perfectly and completely, we may not even be aware of some of the functions yet of progesterone or insulin or estrogen or anything else that we're trying to duplicate or imitate in the body. And so granted, there are people who've had their thyroids totally cut out surgically, and they may need some kind of a stimulus synthetically to do that. They would probably be better off taking just the animal extract, bovine extract of thyroid or something at that point. But that's the concept behind it, and I just refuse to believe that man can be God and that we are capable of duplicating anything in the body. Now, herbs also have two functions in the body. The first functions that herbs have is that herbs are very concentrated foods. Now, everybody agrees that carrots are good for your eyes. My dad, when I was a little girl, I wish I could remember the whole thing, but one night at the dinner table, my father, who's normally fairly quiet, spontaneously burst out with this little poem, carrots are good for your eyes. And I can't remember the rest of it, but I remember that moment in my family's history. But that's because carrots are very, very high in beta-carotene and other substances and trace minerals that are extremely important in order to have night vision and to have your eyes function properly. And now we're finding out that beta-carotene is critical for the immune system and that it's an antioxidant and all these other benefits. And so people agree that carrots are good for the eyes. By the same token, though, other plants are good for certain other organs and systems in the body in the same way. Dandelion, for example, is very high in sodium, the trace mineral sodium, which is a major component of the stomach lining cells, so that the stomach cells are not eaten away by the acid that you need in order to digest your proteins. And so dandelion provides the raw materials that you need in order to make a healthy stomach cell. So dandelion's good for the stomach. And parsley's high in potassium, so it's good for the kidneys, and so forth and so on. Do you understand how that's working? You're just giving the body exactly what it needs to make a healthy cell. Now, in everybody's body, you're making about 3 million cells a day. And so it follows that you would want to provide the kind of nutrition, the materials, the building blocks, to make those cells functional. I've told people many times that I think America functions on the Rumpelstiltskin theory of nutrition. You know, he made gold out of straw, and we make brain cells out of Twinkies. It just, somehow we think that that works, and I've never seen it to be true. And so using the herbs and the supplemental foods is a way to guarantee that whatever cells you're making on a given day are going to have the best chance of being very well-rounded, very solid structural cells. And that's why I encourage eating just lots and lots of different kinds of food. Okay, we want to get as much variety there as possible. I used to believe that if you ate right, you would never need a vitamin or any kind of a supplementation, and I don't believe that anymore. The reason that I don't believe that anymore is that I've seen too many Department of Agriculture studies and other studies that are showing that basically our food, it's not possible to eat right in that sense anymore. The way that we have farmed for the past 30 and 40 years is such that we've destroyed our soil. And so even where you have organic produce, which is dramatically higher than other produce, the Department of Agriculture study, I think it was about 2 years ago, showed that the spinach, the iron content of spinach, for example, that was organically grown was 4 times higher than spinach that was not organically grown. Why? Because a plant also is not Rumpelstiltskin, and it can only draw out of the soil what's in the soil. And since we've only been concerned with, nitrogen and phosphorus, and I forget what the third one is, these 3 substances that we use with the artificial fertilizers, and very often put them in a form that the body really can't, or the plant really can't extract anyway. So we farmed that way for so many years that these substances don't exist anymore in the soil. And the organic farmers are composting and so forth, and so they've got a higher level of those minerals in there. But we're certainly very, very far from virgin soil. And we're far away from giving the land a Sabbath, which was a practice farmers worldwide. In fact, the Amish farmers today still do that. They rotate their crops, and they give them a field of rest. Last summer, I took my children up to the Virginia, the whole 13 colonies kind of tour. And when we were at Monticello, one of the things that was so interesting at Thomas Jefferson's home and also at George Washington's home was their plan for crop rotation. And they were very, very scientific about their farming, and they all allowed for a season for the land to lie fallow. And in Mount Vernon, George Washington's plan allowed 1 year of just flat fallow for the land to be just inundated with weeds and whatever nature would allow to grow in that plot. And the second year that it was fallow, it was used as a pasture area for the cattle, so that the cattle were eating all of those nutritious weeds and leaving their droppings there. And then the next year it would be tilled and used as a field for the most demanding crop. We don't do those kinds of things anymore. We plant the same crops over and over and over again. We use just the synthetic fertilizers. And so even, again, as I said, eating organically, in another 20 years maybe we'll have soil that's back up to capacity. But until then, I think that we're all going to need to supplement. We're also up against much, much more in the way of environmental stress. The air that we breathe is no longer pure air. The water we drink is no longer pure water. And so we have all of these other things to deal with that our bodies were not originally created to have to cope with. And so I no longer believe that everybody should just be able to eat a good, healthy diet and never have to have any supplementation, because I don't think that there's anywhere in America that we could do that. I mean, maybe there are a few isolated farms out in rural Montana or somewhere. But I really am beginning to have my doubts even to that extent. So herbs are providing that very concentrated form of food that most of us would not otherwise get in the variety or in the specific needs that we have as individual bodies. The second property that herbs have, or capacity that herbs have, is to work energetically in the body. And by that I mean they stimulate certain types of motion or movement in the body. If you think about putting a lemon into your mouth, you know, even just thinking about it, some of you are going to get a little puckery. Lemons are very astringent, and they tend to tighten up and draw and contract tissues. Converse to that, you would have other things like bitters and things like aromatic herbs, like an onion. Okay, if you put an onion in your mouth, what starts to happen? I don't even have to get them into my mouth. I must really respond well to aromatics. I get an onion anywhere within 5 feet of me, you know, and everything starts moving very, very rapidly. So you increase the function of the body with aromatic things. And a lot of those herbs that are on my shelf in capsules are things that you all have in your kitchen. We're going to do that food class I'm real excited about with the first aid from the kitchen and that kind of stuff. But you've all got ginger and garlic and red peppers, and those are all aromatic herbs, cinnamon. And what happens when you smell any of those things? Immediately you start getting stimulated, you know, you get hungry, it smells exciting, and you start salivating, and all these things happen because of those stimulating herbs. And so those are the properties that herbs have. They can be very, very, cause you to expand tissue and want to expel something. They can tighten tissue. They can soothe and relax and calm tissue, loosen it up, or they can stimulate tissue like an onion would. So those are the 4 properties that all plants are going to have. And those are the other aspect of herbal working. So do you see there's no parallel here with a drug? Now, there have been some herbs that have been tested as drugs and found valid, frankly. The United States government did some studies in the 1940s with garlic, and they found it to be effective against typhus and measles and cholera and mumps. And I mean, the list just went on and on and on. In fact, I read recently that Albert Schweitzer had used garlic to treat typhus in the Congo, and of course he received a Nobel Prize for his work helping to take medical care to the poor natives of inland Africa. And garlic was one of the mainstays of his practice. So there are those herbs like that. There are herbs like golden seal that have been documented to have antibiotic properties. But when herbs are used as a drug in that sense, they're also going to have some of the downsides that drugs have on occasion. Not with the case of garlic, but golden seal in lots of people will cause even the healthy bacteria to be diminished after a period of time. So we need, instead of worrying about treating that stuff from the top down, to come underneath and try to figure out what is going on here and why. In the case of Micah, I think all of us are born with some kind of a weak link. You know, I've not met a perfect body yet. Micah's weak link is his sinuses. Now, he just inherited sinus passages that are a little bit narrower than is really ideal, and that's not going to change. And to this day, Micah, having never been back to a doctor for an illness, when he gets run down, too much junk food, too many late nights, he gets stuffy. Some people get stomach aches, some people get headaches, some people get, nauseous, whatever. But everybody's got their weak link. And so it follows that if you lower the intake level of solid nutrients and you increase the stress level of the body, what's going to break first? It's going to be your weak link. And everybody's got a different one with that. And so with Micah, the weak link was the sinuses. Now, I ended up with Micah leaving him on 1 capsule a day of a sinus combination called SNX for over a year before I felt like I could just take him off and he was fine. So that's just not a part of his maintenance program. But now, knowing what I know, I can look back and I can see, yes, Micah did have bowel problems. Yes, Micah did have a challenge digesting a couple of different things. And I can see where those problems came from. And that's what we really want to do in the body, is figuring out what's going on. Which of these chimneys aren't working? How can we get these chimneys working better? And so with Micah now, when I do a whole body check for him, consistently what he's needed has been something to build his bowel, to strengthen that muscle just a little bit and help his digestive capacity increase. And when we do those things, then the other things are not going to develop. He's not going to manifest it through the sinuses because those other chimneys are all going to be opened back up. And that's with my kids. You know, I had a kid who came up with a cold last weekend. He'd been away for a couple of days, and he came back with stuffy, but he also came back with terrible gas. So when I was putting his herbs together, I wasn't just trying to give him a bunch of herbs that I've read were good for colds. I wanted to get his bowels opened up a little bit. And that's when you read the books that say, yes, just do an enema for everything, like Back to Eden. You can see what they're trying to accomplish. They're going back to that very beginning and trying to get those chimneys opened up. So with Micah or with anybody else that I've dealt with, we want to look at what are we really trying to do here. Do we want to just get rid of the problem, the disease, the symptoms that we're seeing? Because that's what a disease is. Okay, a disease is a collection of symptoms that somebody named. Somebody got them all together and said, people are shaking, and they're having twitches, and they tend to be elderly, and they're having these other problems, and what do we call it? Parkinson's disease. Why? Is it a Parkinson that did it? No, Dr. Parkinson was the one who sat down and said, gee, I'm seeing a lot of people who have these same sets of symptoms recurring, and so we call it a name. Ways to understand, to translate those diseases into what's happening in the body are to look at the names of the diseases, and it's really usually a clue. Somebody said once that doctors are the world's highest paid translators. You tell them what's wrong with you, and they say it back to you in Latin. Okay, you go in and you say, man, you know, my joints are just so swollen and so sore and so hot, and they say, you have arthritis, which means what? Inflammation of the joints. They've told you. You just told them, and they said it back to you, okay? So you can go, and there are lots of herbs to treat these diseases, and you can go to the books, and it'll say, okay, for this disease you do this, and for this disease you do that, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I believe the reason for that, like with a cough, for example, is that we're not looking at what's causing the cough. Why is the cough here? And that's what I hope to help you all figure out. Why is that cough there? Is it a cough because you're breathing something irritating? Is it a cough because you've got no mucous membranes left because you've not digested protein for years and everything's dissolved in there? You know, what is really going on here? And I think one of the ways to help you understand that is to tell you about the Swamp Thing. I promised we'd do wood stoves and Swamp Thing. Well, this is time for the Swamp Thing. The Swamp Thing. Remember the movie? Big horrid creature that came out. Well, you know, I think that this analogy is even closer to the movie than I had ever thought about until just this moment. But the original theory of disease was that evil spirits, or ill humors, they were called in the Middle Ages, sort of just wafted through the air and randomly chose people and made them sick. Okay, for no good reason. Well, it depended on your culture, actually. In some places it was for no good reason. In some places it was because you were sinful. In some places it was because your parents had done a bad thing. But for whatever reason, these ill humors, these evil spirits just sort of showed up and picked people, and you got sick. Well, then came the discovery of the microscope, right? And we had people looking at all these weird things that they were seeing that they didn't know were there before. And so we have who? Louis Pasteur, who looks down at these little things and he says, Eureka! I found it! It's not ill humors, it's not evil spirits, it is these things! They waft through the air and randomly choose people and make them sick. Okay? Now we haven't changed the theory at all. The theory of disease was exactly the same. We just changed the culprit. We found somebody new to blame the problem on. But the theory didn't change in the least. Well, I think that everything is on the earth for a purpose. I mean, I'm just very altruistic and idealistic, and I really believe that there's nothing here that wasn't here for a reason. And so I started thinking and looking at what is the purpose of a bacteria. Now, a bacteria is here on the earth to break down dead, decaying matter. That's its job, right? We don't usually have bacteria go out and pick perfectly healthy trees and fell them in the forest and then decay them. We have bacteria move into trees that have been felled by some other cause and decay them down and make nice little stuff for us to walk on and mushrooms to grow in and things like that. And so we look at bacteria and we say their job in life, the measure of their creation, is to break down dead, decayed stuff. Now, I look back at Micah, okay? And I think about Micah's sinuses. Now, we've got narrow sinus passages here, right? Probably not getting a lot of good circulation through them. And we've already talked about these chimneys that are all backed up. And so if a self-respecting bacteria wanders through the neighborhood and happens upon my son's sinuses full of dead, decaying stuff, what is his moral obligation? To move in, set up house, quickly multiply, and break down dead, decaying matter. I mean, this is like their noble cause for humanity, and we're trying to blame them for making us sick. That's kind of like the Swamp Thing. Now, if you went out and you saw a swamp covered with hovering mosquitoes, like we do have in Florida, do you look at that swamp and immediately say, look what those bugs did to that water. Of course not. It would be ludicrous. What we do instead is we go out with the spray gun. We wipe out all of the mosquitoes, and what happens tomorrow? A whole new generation of mosquitoes. Why? Because we now have still a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. It's not the swamp's fault that the bugs are there. The bugs are there because it's a perfect home. It's the right environment. And in our bodies, the same things happen. Now, these bacteria, like us, being living creatures, have some limitations. We can only live within certain parameters. We have to have certain oxygen levels. We have to have certain temperature ranges. We have to have certain types of food. And if any of those three things are missing, we will die. We just can't exist outside of those parameters. And the same thing is true of viruses and bacteria and even fungus and all these other horrible things that just come and pick on us. They do stuff to us, and we are innocent victims. Okay? This is the theory that we've lived with. Well, if we go back to taking responsibility for our health and we take it the whole way to the nth degree, we say, okay, what am I doing that is making a home for these bugs? What am I doing in here that's making a perfect environment that makes it necessary for them to move in and be here? In most cases, it's simple things. You're not getting rid of those chimneys or opening up those chimneys and getting rid of the dead decaying matter any other way, so your body has to move it in. In other cases, you're not digesting things that you're taking in, and so you're producing such huge amounts of dead decaying matter that the chimneys couldn't possibly handle it all at once. And you need the outside help that the bacteria or whatever can provide. But it's also interesting how the body responds to those things. Now, we said they've got to have certain parameters, and one of those parameters is temperature. And what's the first thing that happens when people get sick? They get a fever. Their body starts to get hot, okay? Where do you get a higher fever? With a bacterial infection or with a viral infection? A virus, always a virus. It's interesting, isn't it, that a bacteria dies somewhere between 101 and 103 degrees, usually closer to the 101. A bacteria cannot exist in temperatures higher than that. A virus doesn't die until somewhere between 103 and 104. And so our body recognizes exactly what it's dealing with, and it goes after it. And it tries to address the issue by raising the body's temperature, by sometimes increasing the rate of excretion. What happens? Do you understand now why you get diarrhea when you get a viral infection? What's your body trying to do? You've got something breeding inside of you that is a living organism, okay? Whether it's a bacteria, a virus, a parasite, or whatever, it is a living critter, which means what? It's breathing inside of you, inhaling and exhaling waste matter. It's eating inside of you, and guess what else it does inside of you? It excretes the waste products of its eating, and it sends those out. And so you've got all this extra load that the body's trying to get rid of. And that's why a lot of people will get diarrhea with viral infections. What else do you get with infections? You get rashes, don't you? Your skin heats up, you've got your fever, and your skin sometimes will force matter through. And when do you feel better after you've had a fever? When the fever breaks. And how does the fever break? You start to perspire. You sweat, you soak the sheets, you eliminate through the skin, you force that chimney wide open, and you start flushing things out. Do you see that you have an absolutely perfect system? It works. If you support the system, everything is going to work. We don't need to keep finding new drugs for this particular bug and for that particular virus and all the rest. We need to help the body learn to fight its own battles. And that's become recognized even in the very progressive medical community. Now, I've heard it said that it takes about 20 years on average for medical research to become medical practice. And that's because, there's the lag time with getting that information distributed, with getting it then put into textbook form, with getting it then into the medical schools, which gets it then into the hands of the doctors that are using it. So you can see that there's going to be that lag time. One of, I think, the most angry times I ever felt with a doctor was when I was pregnant with my second daughter, or my second child, who's my daughter, and I had a severe anemia problem. I learned that I developed pernicious anemia when I'm pregnant. I stopped manufacturing P12, and my hemoglobin bottomed out, so my hemoglobin was down at 7.6, and normal is up at around 12. And so the midwife said, promise me you are going to go home and take this iron and get your prescription filled. And I was half delirious from having no oxygen in my body, and I said, okay, I do it. And I went home, and I took her prescription iron for 4 weeks, okay? It was in the beginning of my 7th month, and I went from a 7.6 to an 8-something in that 4-week period. And I went in and had thought this through enough to say, I promised that I'd take this, and so I took it. Now I'm going to go home and I'm going to do it my way. And I told her I was going to take the ferrous gluconate, and I was going to, do some other things with it. And she was like, oh, no, don't do that until we check with the pharmacist. So she called the pharmacist, and the pharmacist said, well, she's right. She is going to metabolize that kind a whole lot easier. But her insurance company's not going to pay for that, and you need to let her know. I'm thinking, this is, forget the insurance. I need to breathe. So I went and I took my own iron, and in 2 weeks, my hemoglobin went from the 8.3 or 4, whatever it had been, to an 11. Half the time, and I'd had more than 3 times the increase by taking iron that my body could metabolize. And so when we were talking with the midwife and the doctor in one of the classes, I brought that up, and I said, why wasn't I told to use what was best for me? Why? And why didn't the doctor even know that that was the best form? And the person in the doctor's office, the midwife, said, well, you have to realize that doctors are very busy people, and they don't have time to keep up with every little article and journal that comes across their desk. As a consumer, it's your responsibility to share that information with them when you find it. I thought, then why am I paying him $3,000 to take care of this pregnancy if I have to teach him? But that was the thing. The doctors aren't going to take the time. And in many cases, they legitimately don't have the time to read every little journal and article that comes across their desk. And so you can see why it's a realistic estimate to say it's going to take 20 years from the time they discover something until it's common practice among doctors. Well, the Pasteur Clinic, Pasteur Institute in France is one of still the most prominent medical research facilities in the world. And they have now come out and said, now remember, the Salk Institute. The Salk Institute is named for Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine. And Jonas Salk's theory, after the Salk Institute, after his death, he actually denounced a lot of the vaccines. The live polio vaccine, we're the only country in the Western world still to use it, and the Salk Institute has repeatedly warned against that. That's another whole subject. But anyway, the Salk Institute has come out and said that we now understand the thymus function. This was an evolutionary holdover less than 10 years ago in medical textbooks. And understanding the thymus function makes the concept of immunization sort of obsolete, because we now know that the thymus is capable of generating cells, T cells, that will recognize and destroy any invader in the body. And so we don't have to trick it. We don't have to manipulate it. We don't have to try to give it a genetic message that's going to pass down from cell to cell, because we're not even sure that that works now. We just have to feed it. We have to make it work. So do you understand the difference in principle here? We don't need to keep finding new drugs. We need to keep finding new ways to feed our bodies and new ways to support it. You've all heard, I'm sure, the story of the man who laughed his way to health. Reader's Digest, I think that's what they called the article. The man who had cancer and checked out of the hospital. He was at Johns Hopkins University, checked out and went into the hotel across the street and figured if he was going to die, he was going to die happy. They had given him literally weeks to live. And he said if he was going to die, he'd rather not die in the hospital. So he agreed to keep going for treatment, but he checked into the hotel across the street, and he loved the old, like the Three Stooges and the Groucho Marx and those kind of comedies. And so he got all these things, and he started watching all these comedies, and he went into total remission. It can't be a cure unless it's done by a drug, okay? It's illegal in this country to cure anything unless you do it with a pharmaceutical product. But you can't have spontaneous remissions. You can't even have miracles anymore, but you can have spontaneous remissions. And so he went into spontaneous remission that lasted for the rest of his life, which was, 30 years or something. He may still be alive, by laughing. And they've done studies now, and they find out that you increase your T cell production dramatically by laughing, by smiling, by hugging, and by tapping it. And what do people in the world do when they get bad news? Immediately, right here, right at the thymus. Okay? So we don't understand the principle, but we don't have to be afraid anymore of the swamp thing. We don't have to worry about the boogeyman coming to get us. We need to figure out how to build up our own resources to fight off the boogeyman when it comes, to recognize it, and to say, excuse me, but this is not your domain, okay? I don't have the right parameters here. I've got oxygen in my body. I dare you, come on, because oxygen tends to be very prohibitive. Bacteria, viruses, fungus, especially parasites, do not like highly oxygenated environments. Oxygen is so important, this whole breathing thing that I mentioned on just briefly. There was an article, I think it was in Time or Life a few years ago. They found a prehistoric bubble of air. You know how they do like find fossils and stuff? It was in amber. Well, they found this bubble in amber, and they thought it'd be really cool to find out what was in the bubble. What was the air like, however many millions of years ago it was supposed to have been. So they put it into a vacuum, they popped the bubble, broke the bubble, and the headline on the article was, "Who breathed all the air?" Because the oxygen level in the air in those days was, I think it was like 40 times higher. It was just this incredible increase in the amount of oxygen that there used to be in the air. And they said, now given that information, we understand why dragonflies were this big and why people lived 600 years and why plants got this tall and all these other things happened because they were so highly oxygenated. Bacteria don't like that. Parasites cannot abide it. And most of the harmful organisms that are moving into our body do not do well where there's a very oxygen-rich environment. That's why I wasn't joking when I said we could just breathe and make a tremendous difference in our health. That's why I say we can just start expanding our lungs. We can stop doing this stuff. Pull our stomachs down into position and start breathing deep. That's one of the reasons I believe that so many people who do take up meditation or yoga or that kind of thing suddenly find their overall health level increases. It's not just that they're more relaxed, but their immunity goes up and all these other things because they focus on learning to breathe. And most people just don't do that anymore. They've got stomachs sitting way up high, blocking their lungs. They don't take the time, and we don't have all that oxygen anymore anyway. So we have to really try extra hard to get that air circulating in there. And if you can do that, that's like putting up the National Guard at the swamp, saying, sorry, there's no dead decayed matter here. There's nothing for you to eat. You can't live here anymore. We're sorry, but the oxygen level is too high. You're not going to be able to multiply and do your thing in here, so you might as well leave. We're sorry, but this body recognizes foreign invaders and doesn't let them just sort of lie latent for long periods of time to multiply and reproduce inside of me. So you might as well leave. And suddenly the boogeyman becomes less fearful. And I think that that's an evolutionary process. Okay, you're going to go through that time. And most people start out because they've got headaches, they've got stomach aches, they've got something, and they are trying to find something to replace the drugs that haven't worked in their body, like I was. But there's a step beyond that. And you do it one thing at a time. And if you're at the stage where you want to look up in an herb book and it says cough and you want to try everything under cough, that's good. That's a first step. And you've learned something, and you'll learn what works, and you'll learn more about what doesn't work, and so forth. And you make those first steps. And then you learn a little bit more, and you learn a little bit more. And people are always saying, well, where did you go to school? Where did you learn all this? I learned it the way that people have learned it for centuries and centuries. Anytime I found anybody that I thought knew anything, I latched on, and I read their books, and I listened to their tapes, and I went to their workshops, and then I tried it. And anything that you see in these classes, anything that you hear in these classes doesn't mean anything until you go home and you do it. I've heard the definition of learning being a three-legged stool, where someone gives you the information and you hear the information, but that's only two legs and your stool is going to fall over. So it's not until you get that third leg in there, which is you go out and you teach it to somebody else or you do it, before you've gotten that circle complete and you're really going to know the information. And then you can stop being afraid. Now, people will always say to me, you don't use any antibiotics, but what if you had? And they'll name a disease. Well, I can tell you a story on that one. About, 6 or 8 years ago, I got blood poisoning. And it was kind of a fluky thing as to how it happened and so forth. But I had a blister on the last knuckle of my little finger that popped. And it popped in hot, soapy dishwater, fresh dishwater. So there was no real dirt in there. But somehow or other, there was a strep germ there, and it jumped into my body. And I ended up with blood poisoning. Now, I knew a little bit about herbs at the time. You know, I had played with it. And so I started taking a lot of garlic, and I was putting compresses on it. And I was doing everything that I knew to deal with this blood poisoning. And after about 2 weeks, the streak was to about here. So I hadn't killed it. I mean, obviously, I was holding it at bay because it should have taken about 3 hours for it to be that far. And it took 2 whole weeks, but obviously, I was not getting this problem gone. And so I went to the doctor and I got the antibiotics, and I took some acidophilus to neutralize the effects of the antibiotics, and did some other things to try to balance it out. And I continued to take the garlic and so forth, but it took the antibiotics to get rid of the blood poisoning. Well, about 4 or 5 years ago, 4 years ago maybe, my husband at the time was mowing the yard, and he got a wasp sting on the back of his arm, and apparently, just swatted at it and didn't realize he'd got it and scratched it open while he was mowing the yard, so there was a lot of dirt there. And that night he went to take a shower, and I saw him lift up his arm, after the shower, and I looked, and he had a streak about this long starting to go into the armpit of blood poisoning from this infected wasp sting. And I said, you know, once it's in your armpit, I can't see where it's going. We can't watch this thing. You've got 2 hours. And if that is not out of the armpit, that streak, by then, you need to go to the emergency room and deal with this. This is, you know, it could be to the heart in such a quick period of time. And so we pulled out the big guns. I mean, we started doing some heavy, heavy cleansing. We did coffee enemas. We did, I mean, all kinds of green drink. We just pulled out the big guns, and we did everything in the world that I could find in a book that said, do this for blood poisoning. And it worked. In the 2 hours, the streak was gone. We kept doing it, you know, throughout the night. And the next morning, there was nothing. It was completely down. And so we resolved the blood poisoning. About a year and a half ago, my little one, Aaron, got blood poisoning. And he had apparently scratched a mosquito bite open in his sleep during the night, and then he spent all day in high-top sneakers and red socks. And so he'd had 12 hours of, you know, hot, dirty stuff inside of his socks. And I took his shoe off right before bedtime and looked at his foot and went, oh my goodness, you know, and it was the bite was down by his toe, and the streak was just starting to cross the ankles, about that far up his leg, on the front of his foot. And I just thought, you know, here we go. And I didn't want to do a whole lot for him. Because it was late at night, and I just thought, okay, this is obviously not life-threatening. Even if I wait till the morning, you know, if it's gone up his leg, it's still not going to be to the heart or anywhere deadly, so I'll take him to the doctor in the morning. But in the meantime, I used some things topically to increase the circulation to that area, to really dramatically increase the circulation in the area. And I gave him some herbs just to help strengthen his liver, which is what breaks the thing down, and gave him one little garlic capsule and thought, you know, it'll still hold it at bay anyway, and in the morning I'll take him to the doctor. He woke up with no streak, nothing, 9 hours later. Totally gone. Now I'm telling you that story because I think that's the cycle that most of us go through. We try it, it doesn't work, we did our best, maybe we'll try it next time and maybe we won't. And I think that's where a lot of people fall off the boat and say, oh well, herbs don't work, you know. The next time I went overboard, I did one of everything because I wanted to be sure it would work. The third time, I understood the principles. Why did we have blood poisoning? We had some stagnant matter there, and that bacteria was multiplying really fast. So by increasing the circulation topically, getting that circulation really increased there, we no longer had stagnant matter. The bacteria was not happy anymore. It couldn't multiply nearly as rapidly because that increased circulation meant what? We're getting more oxygen to that area. And the lymphatic system is going to be working better and breaking stuff down, and it's going to be increasing the flow of blood, is going to increase the flow of T cells. Everything's going to increase in that area by increasing the circulation. And the liver is what's got to break stuff down. That's your detox center for the body. So we used a couple of bitter herbs to get his liver kicked into gear. And garlic is actually documented antibiotic. It will kill bacteria on contact. And it didn't take a whole lot of it. I really don't credit the garlic entirely. But by having the principles down of what was happening here, it was no big deal. It wasn't a crisis anymore, and so the blood poisoning wasn't a problem. So I'm not here to tell people not to use doctors because I think that they are valid. My personal feeling is that doctors really belong in crisis care. You know, when my Aaron collided with the ceiling fan, I was really glad there was somebody else to sew him back together, 23 stitches worth, and that somebody could give him a drug so that he didn't have to feel all 23 stitches. I think that's a great blessing and a wonderful situation. I don't think that we should have to be dependent on doctors any more than we should have to be dependent on anybody else to take care of us. And what's really neat is that that's what I see happening here. It's not that people are fed up with doctors. It's that people are trying to take responsibility. They want to take care of themselves now. They want to learn more about how things are working, and they want to be a little bit more in control. I've seen it manifested in articles where people are talking, you know, reading articles about how to talk to your doctor, how to get questions from your doctor. I had a client in on Monday who was just really upset because his doctor had just given him a list of foods that he could eat and foods that he couldn't. Didn't explain why. Didn't explain what he was trying to accomplish with this diet. He just said, you know, you need to be on a 1,400 calorie diet here. Do this. People want information now. People want to learn. You're here because you've decided to learn. You're watching the videotape because you want to learn. And so we want to make that information available to you, and we want you to read. We want you to educate yourselves. You know, my objective is to get you into my office and then not to have you coming back all the time. I love to see you, and you're always welcome to stop in. And, you know, when I'm doing rechecks, if I'm there, you're welcome to come in. Or if you want to make an appointment for me to see you, that's great because you've all become people that I care about, and it's neat to see you. But I think that hopefully you're going to be learning more and able to take care of your families more and more. I don't want to be the expert, okay? And there are people that I guess want to do that. But I feel like this is really all very simple. And that's why I told you the blood poisoning story. The more I understood, the more I learned, the easier it got to deal with things and not to be traumatized by this condition or that condition, and not to worry about what the name is. And sometimes people will want to do that. Yes, but have you ever dealt with this disease? No, but I've dealt with bodies before, and it seems to me that all bodies are basically similar in their form and function, and that the same principles are going to apply, and then we don't have to get so worried about all the different practices that are out there. So we want to understand what is going on in your body. And most of us, if we stop and listen, will know. I think the most offensive statement I have ever heard, bar almost any, was in a class one time, a childbirth class again, when the nurse midwife who was conducting the class got very frustrated because a couple of the couples were not listening and paying attention to her. And she said, and this is almost a quote, "You guys had better pay attention, because what you don't realize is that the ability to have children has been bred out of you, and you don't know how to do it anymore." And I thought that was really an interesting concept, that the ability to have children could be bred out of anybody. I mean, bodies still did it without a lot of planning a lot of times. But there are people who believe that everything that this body does is something that has to be handled by an expert. The other challenge that I have with the medical community is that they tend to perceive everything being very much parts and pieces. And I think that when we're dealing with herbs, trying to substitute herbs for drugs, that we're still approaching things the same way. My mother has had a lot of structural problems. It's a long family history and so forth. But she went in to have surgery for some long ago injured neck discs. And she decided she would allow them to remove one of these very badly damaged and calcified discs. And in the course of doing that, when they did the bone graft to take up that space, they pinched a nerve in the bone graft. And as the fusion took and grew, it permanently pinched that nerve. And so my mom has had chronic pain, referred pain in her arms, very severely ever since that surgery, and will never be able to be free completely from that pain because of the surgery. And about a year later, while she's still dealing with this terrible shoulder pain and arm pain, she had knee surgery for a knee injury. She tore a cartilage, and we just had the arthroscopic surgery to clean up the cartilage inside of her knee. And the doctor, after he looked at her after the post-op visit, said, "Well, we want to put you on crutches now for several weeks." And the kind of crutches he wanted to put her on were the forearm crutches, where all of the weight is on the arms. And she said to the doctor, "Well, am I really supposed to be using these? Isn't that going to hurt my shoulder?" And he said, "Oh, I don't know. You'd have to talk to your other surgeon about that. That I only do knees," basically was his comment. And so I'm thinking, when I was a little kid, I learned that song, the head bone connected to the neck bone connected to the shoulder bones. I mean, everything was parts and pieces that hooked up. And the concept that we have in our culture is that, yeah, but you can do something on this side and it doesn't affect this side. Well, if you've ever sprained an ankle, you know that that's a fallacy. Because after a week of hobbling around, which ankle hurts the worst? It's the good one. And it's the good one because you have asked it to do so much more than it was ever intended or meant to do. And I find the same thing happens inside of the bodies. When we have an organ that's not working quite right, what our tendency is in our culture is to go after the organ that's making a lot of noise. Okay? You're constipated. What do? We give you a laxative. Why are you constipated? Your arms are hurting from these forearm crutches. I only do knees. And I found the same approach with many, many people in the natural health field, because they're trying to substitute herbs or homeopathics or whatever remedies for drugs, and to use them in exactly the same way, from the top down. My favorite herb story of all time concerns that issue. This is a true story. When I was out in Utah for a meeting, I was riding in the van to the airport, and one of the men that I was sitting next to asked what I did, and I told him I was an herbalist, and he says, "Oh, cool, can you do anything for hypoglycemia, And I said, "Well, I'm not a physician and I don't treat diseases." I said, "But with hypoglycemia, typically what you have is a pancreas that's not doing its job. And whether it's, producing too much insulin or too little insulin, if you can support the pancreas and cause the pancreas, provide the support for the pancreas to function correctly, then I would imagine that those symptoms would disappear at either extreme. And so, we went on and exchanged business cards and kind of left it at that. Well, when I got out of the van, the guy who'd been driving the van, while he was getting my luggage, said to me, that stuff always kind of interested in me. What would you do for somebody like that? I guess referring to this other man. And I said, well, again, I'm not a physician. I'm not trying to treat diseases. And I said, but I typically try to check the whole body and find out what's going on. And he says, well, how do you do that? And I said, well, I use muscle response testing, which checks the electrical circuits in the body. And, so I just to demonstrate it real quick, I checked his pancreas, and I said, your pancreas seems to be, conducting real well. It seems to be really strong. Needs a little bit of support, but not much. I said, but I'd really work on your liver. And so I suggested some herbs to him, and he asked me to send them to him. And this is a total stranger. I mean, I don't know if I'm ever going to talk to this man or get a check or anything from the guy. And so I suggested to him that he might consider using a supplement called P14, which is a pancreas combination that my 3-year-old was taking 3 capsules of a day and just using 1 a day of that combination. And that he might want to use much larger amounts. He needed, I think, 7 or 8 of a very powerful liver-building herb with a lot of bitters that causes that liver just to open wide up and get moving. And so I sent him off and never thought any more about it. Well, 3 weeks later, I got a phone call from Utah, and this man said, you sent me a bunch of herbs, and I just wondered how fast they work. And I said, this is probably the FDA at the other end. What do you mean work? Herbs are foods, and like any foods, if you're hungry and you eat, you're not hungry anymore, so sometimes symptoms will disappear fairly rapidly if it's deficiency symptoms. What exactly are you getting at? And he says, oh, well, I've been a diabetic for 7 years, and I decided to stop taking insulin and try these herbs. I will kill this man. I would never, never, never tell anyone to cold turkey any kind of medication. And even if it's an aspirin a day that you've been taking, I would not encourage you just to stop suddenly doing it, because you could throw the body into a very, stressed situation. And he says, but anyway, with the insulin, my blood sugar was around 130, okay, which is still quite elevated. And he says, and ever since I've been taking these herbs for 2 weeks, my blood sugar is 111 or 112 every single day. Dead normal. Now, somebody watching that from a diagnostic standpoint would have had a ball, right? She said his pancreas works. He's a diabetic. I didn't know this man. In the body, your pancreas produces insulin. And it does so in response to precursor messages and enzymes produced by the liver. Now, in this particular individual's case, apparently his pancreas was quite functional and perfectly capable of making insulin, but it didn't know it was supposed to. The liver wasn't sending out that message. And so once the liver started to work, and it started sending out this precursor message, his pancreas started saying, insulin, you want insulin? We'll do insulin. And boom, he got insulin. Now, did we cure his diabetes? Didn't even know the man had diabetes. But what we did was we provided his body with the fuel that it needed to work effectively. Now, if I was an herbalist trying to play doctor, trying to substitute drugs, herbs or supplements for drugs, I could have come in and said, gee, you're a diabetic, what you need is some golden seal or UV-URC. That'll drop that blood sugar right on down. And it would have been true, and it would have worked. But frankly, I don't think that taking golden seal for the rest of your life is any better than taking insulin for the rest of your life. I mean, it may be a little better. It's not going to do the liver damage that sometimes synthetic things will do and so forth. But the principle is still you're dependent on something else entirely. And there may be people who do need that kind of support. But in this particular individual's case, all he needed was to get his liver to work. And he made some dietary suggestions. We talked about different foods that supported the liver, and he started using the supplements. And in 5 or 6 months, he didn't need anything at all anymore to stimulate his liver. And his pancreas, he never needed any support for at all after that particular time. And so that's the way that I try to work. And that's why I'm not trying to say to people, well, if you've got this condition, you need to try these herbs. There are lots of reference books for that, and I know what I did when I first started, because that's how I started. We're dealing with a cold, what can I do for a cold? And there are some excellent herbal combinations that are available, already put together by people who did understand those concepts in many ways. But it also helps you to understand why sometimes combinations don't even work, why a single herb is a lot easier. Simple things sometimes work the best. And it's been interesting to me to watch my own evolution. As I've told you with the blood poisoning story, how more and more I tend to work with single herbs instead of massive combinations of things. Because as I begin to understand more about the properties of individual herbs, it's easier to say, okay, all we need here is something that's a little bit more astringent or something to open this bile duct a little bit more. And I don't have to use a shotgun approach nearly as much. And so most of us can find that we don't need to have enormous amounts of supplementation. Now, since you are taking the approach here of trying to restructure the body, you are going to need to do some long-term support. And most people with an herbal program need to use that program for 4 to 6 months. I find with my clients that I usually recheck after about 3 weeks because the quantity of things that they need usually will go down simply because you've made up for some lost time. And you've got a better base to work from. And so the quantities of things you need should reduce fairly rapidly. But most people, it's going to take 4 to 6 months to replace enough of those cells that you're going to make a permanent difference. And that all of the body is going to be functioning at a much higher level. With mica, remember we started with those herbs, and as soon as the green stuff stopped, we cut it off, and the green stuff came right back. And then I kept him on them for a little bit longer. And then it was 3 or 4 days before he got stuffy. And then I kept him on them for a longer period of time. And we've never had a sinus infection since. So we're trying to work with principles here. We're trying to build the body long term. We're trying to strengthen the systems and help everything function more effectively, because I believe when it does its job, we don't have to worry about giving names to diseases and about coming in from external areas. And that's, again, what most people are trying to do. Now, there are some other supplementary things that we can do to support the body. I prefer to work with herbs over vitamins and over a lot of other things because the body was designed primarily to digest plants. When we look at our bodies, we have very, very long small intestines, which is where the assimilation takes place. And if you look through the animal kingdom, animals that subsist largely on meats, like lions and bears, you know, the carnivorous bears, tend to have very, very short intestinal tracts because protein does decay very rapidly and produce a lot of waste matter in the body, and it does make a nice food source for parasites and so forth, and you know, very often when you're eating meat it does have parasites in it. So you want to eliminate those things through the body very, very quickly. The protein and so forth is accessed fairly quickly also. So that's why you have these short digestive tracts. Well, in the people, we have very long digestive tracts. And while I don't say that everyone should be a vegetarian, I know that I eat meat sparingly, and most of us digest plants more effectively than any other foods. And so herbs are plants, the herbs of the field. And herbs have a couple of advantages that I think are worth noting. One being, of course, that we are designed to digest them, but that's accomplished not only because of our structure, but because of the structure of plants. Plants are made up of vitamins and minerals and fats and proteins and all these other substances that we're going to use as fuel in the body. But they're always in a very balanced, very complete form. Okay? When you're taking a vitamin or a mineral, you're taking something, a substance that's in isolation, that we would never consume in isolation in nature. Even iron, for example. People don't go out and pick up iron and chew on it. We can't. Our body can't do that. And so while you may cook something in an iron pot, if you're using an acid substance, orange juice or tomato sauce or something, and cooking in an iron pot, you will leach some of that iron into the food, but you're not ever going to pick up a chunk of iron and eat it. And in order to be broken down in the body, that iron is going to need a lot of other substances, vitamin C being one of them. And that's true of any mineral or any vitamin that you can name. To use calcium in the body, I mentioned earlier that you need to have large amounts of magnesium, but you also need to have phosphorus and silicon and zinc and other trace minerals in the right proportions and in fairly high quantities, or the body just can't use the calcium. It was real funny when they had the osteoporosis craze first hit, you know, and everybody started taking calcium supplements. They started having sewer troubles in New York City, and when they dredged the sewers, guess what they found? Millions of calcium tablets that the body could not break down. Okay, they're compacted so hard and put in such a form that your body just could not digest them. It's interesting that the body needs large amounts of hydrochloric acid in order to break down the calciums. And so the concept of using an antacid as a calcium supplement is really funny, because if you've ever read the protocol, the suggestions to physicians for using those, they tell you always to make sure that your patient takes it when they're in a very highly acid state. So doesn't make a lot of sense, does it, then, that an antacid could be a calcium supplement that was usable to the body. Now, it's interesting, though, that in nature, the plants where calcium is in very high quantities also tend to be very, very high in other related substances. Horsetail, for example, which people have used for years to strengthen their hair and their nails and so forth, is the highest plant in silicon, which is the binding agent for calcium and for collagen in the cells. And so that's why it helps with these structural things of bones and skin and hair and those kinds of things. Valerian, which is one of the highest plants in calcium, is also high in magnesium and other things, which helps the body to utilize it. And so depending on the need that or the place where you're going to use that calcium in the body, valerian might be better than spinach, or that might be better than horsetail, because of the range of nutrients that's there. So you see again why I keep telling you, eat more different foods. The bigger variety, the more sources that you're going to have for the different nutrients that you need. But that's why in the plant form, you're more able to assimilate it. That's why that iron, in the form that I was using it, which was in an herbal base, was much more accessible to my body than the ferrous sulfate that was in the tablets from the medical community. And that's the case with almost every vitamin or mineral. You want to make sure that you have those other nutrients, or you just can't use them. In many cases, too, a vitamin is in a form that the body will have a harder time breaking down. Most people know that it's easier for the body to utilize beta-carotene to manufacture vitamin A than it is for the body to actually digest vitamin A. Vitamin A in isolation is a fat-based vitamin, which is very important for the liver, all of the fat-based things. But if the liver is very, very stressed and the pancreas isn't producing enzymes, it's going to be very difficult for you to break down your fat-soluble substances. And so it's easier for the body to manufacture that or metabolize it from the beta-carotene than to actually take even an organic source of vitamin A. And I do use some vitamins and minerals. I'm not trying to knock those at all. But I prefer always to use my base as herbs. Herbs are foods, and many of them you have in your closet. You know, parsley and sage and garlic and ginger and dandelion are all on my shelves in capsuled form, simply because most people aren't going to take enough of it. Garlic, in order to be medicinally effective, does have to be raw, and most people won't do that a lot. So taking it in capsules is a little bit easier. But I tend to go with that also because they tend to be stimulating to the digestive system in and of themselves, because they do have a taste. Some of the herbs that I use, I only use in a liquid form, because without the taste, you don't get the full effect in the body. That's especially true of the bitter herbs. Things like Oregon grape are really not particularly effective taken in a dried form. And the form in which you take the herbs makes a big difference. Most people are familiar with herbs in the form of teas. When I was pregnant with my first child, my midwife wanted me to drink 2 quarts a day of red raspberry tea. And if you've ever had red raspberry tea, pure red raspberry tea, it tastes mostly like dirt. That's the closest thing I can come to, but it doesn't have a lot of flavor. And so 2 quarts of it a day was, this was a do-or-die commitment to a healthy home birth, or I would just have not done this at all. And so most people find that it's easier to take a capsulated herb. In the capsules, you're getting the whole herb. With a tea, you're not, and that's the downside. Anything that's water-soluble, you're going to get in a tea. Okay? Your water-soluble properties will come out. Things like trace minerals, as a rule, are not water-soluble simply by soaking them or steeping them in hot water. They have to be extracted differently. And so you're just drinking the tea, you're going to have to, number one, use enormous quantities to have a medicinal effect. And number two, you're going to have to only count on having certain portions or certain aspects of that herb to be valuable to you. Things like aromatic oils are very stimulating. Are very easily extracted in water. You get peppermint tea, for example, and that's real easy to do. But most other things are not going to be extracted quite so easily. So that's the downside to a tea. In the dehydrated form, you're getting the whole herb. The only way to do that in a tea would be to drink your dregs, which, again, our ancestors used to do. So they were getting the trace minerals and the nutrient qualities from those as well. Most people today are used to popping something. In a glycerin base, different properties are extracted. And with children, that's one of the easiest ways to give them herbs. I prefer using glycerin extracts whenever I can because they're alcohol-free. The other forms of extraction are typically, other than water, which is a form of extraction, your teas, typically are either alcohol or vinegar. Vinegar is a tough one. It does work, but it tastes awful. And so it's fine to use it for compresses and things, certain herbs that you want to extract that you're going to use topically. Vinegar can be very pleasant in that way, especially the cider vinegar because it's high in minerals. But it's not something that most people want to be consuming on a regular basis. Alcohol is something that children under 2 definitely cannot process. And children under 4 really aren't equipped to process. And that most of us don't need to be taking in on a regular basis. Alcohol is an excellent extraction agent. And it does break down an awful lot of the properties, all of the soluble properties in the plant material. And so it's a very effective and complete extraction, but it's not something that most people want to be taking in large amounts on a regular basis. When alcohol is especially valuable, I find, is in an emergency situation or a first aid situation, because alcohol acts as a carrying agent. And so in my first aid kits, the emergency kits that I produce, I have all alcohol extracts in there because the alcohol will carry even through the skin, but always through the cell membranes. So that if you're taking something internally, and you're not going to have to wait for any kind of a digestion or assimilation process, it's carried immediately through the cell wall into the bloodstream. And that's very important. When I'm using something like licorice root to stimulate the adrenals of someone who's gone into shock, I don't want to wait for them to break it down. I want it in there right now, and alcohol has the capacity to do that. Okay, so alcohol extractions have a very positive benefit of being quickly absorbed by the body. They also have the downside of stressing the liver. And so, you use them with some discretion there. And then in the dried form. Now, I prefer, as a rule, to use capsules. Sometimes I'll use tablets. But what's important with all of your herbal products is to remember that being foods, the quality and the freshness of them is very, very important. When I really began to think about that was the first time I was giving Micah alfalfa, and I realized one night that I was out, or going to run out the next day, and didn't want to stop him. He was doing so well. So I called a friend of mine that used a lot of herbs, and I said, can you bring me some alfalfa capsules to church tomorrow, because I only have 2 left, and I'm going to need 4 for the day or whatever. So she brought me these alfalfa capsules, and I had my own in my hand when I went to give them to Micah, and I opened up, and mine were sort of a grayish, brownish powder inside this capsule, and hers were this bright green powder inside the capsule, and I went, ooh, alfalfa does look green. And I began to realize that your aging and your processing of those plants is going to be very important in retaining the nutrient quality of them. And I think that's probably the other reason that people get hit or miss results with herbs. There was one herb company that made a flu combination, and I used it once, and it was wonderful. And I used it the next time, and it didn't touch the stuff, and it was just hit or miss. And I think that in many cases that's because of the quality or lack thereof of quality control in the products. So, just like you can buy a bag of carrots that's just straight from the farmer, or you can buy a bag of carrots that's been sitting there for 3 or 4 weeks. If you've ever, left a cucumber too long in the back of your refrigerator, you know that live foods especially have a definite shelf life. And that the fresher they are, the higher the nutrient level is going to be. And so that's going to make a big difference in the quality of your herbs. And I didn't ever really think about that until I looked at those 2 forms of alfalfa. So it's important to check into the quality control of whatever herb products you're going to be using. It was funny because somebody had run out of a product that they were using, just a single herb. And they had stopped in a health food store that was closer to them and picked up something else, and they brought it to me, and they said, I just was going to take this and finish it up since I didn't have any more of yours. Can you test me and see how many? Well, she had gone way up on how many of these she needed compared to the previous time. And so just out of curiosity, I checked her with a bottle of another brand of these herbs, same herb, same weight, everything else, and she needed 5 of the other brand compared to 2 of mine. So obviously there was not a cost savings there. There was not any kind of time savings swallowing 5 instead of 2. But that's how much difference there could be from one brand to another. So just like you are very conscious of the labels that you buy in your supermarkets, you need to be conscious of the quality of the things that you're buying in the supermarket or in the herb department also, because they are not all alike. Your vitamins especially are not all alike. There is a difference between synthetic and organic. And the quickest way I can go into that, because I don't want to spend a lot of time on it tonight, is that if you can imagine 2 gloves, if you've ever owned a pair of gloves, okay, they both look exactly alike. They're the same size, they're the same shape, but they're mirror images of one another, and a right-hand glove will not fit the left hand. You cannot do it. And that's a mirror image. And if especially your fat-soluble vitamins, if it says on it, like with vitamin, it'll say like D-alpha tocopherols, your vitamin E's. If it says DL alpha tocopherol, it's synthetically processed or formulated. It's not the real thing. It's that mirror image. That one little letter is all that makes the difference. And they can still say natural on it, because natural is not a legislated word. They can still say organic on it, because it did come from something, carbon-based. But do you understand how it becomes increasingly important for you to educate yourselves? Because you just can't count on the label saying, all natural, whatever. Vitamin C is probably the best example, because C is a complex. There are 23 parts of vitamin C, and in order to use any one of them, you have to have all of them. In our original government research, they classified ascorbic acid, which is the primary part of vitamin C, as vitamin C. And so even if you take pure ascorbic acid, the body may not be able to utilize it at all if you're totally deficient in bioflavonoid or any of the other nutrients that are necessary. But on the label, it will say pure natural vitamin C, because our law says ascorbic acid is vitamin C. And so even though the body can't use it, it's better. So I prefer people getting their vitamins from food sources. I sell almost no vitamin C. I always have it in my office because there are people who really want it, but it's very rare that I suggest that somebody buy a bottle of vitamin C as a rule, because I think that they're better off to buy a box of organic oranges for the same price, and get the whole food. Get their foods or their nutrients from the whole foods wherever possible. And I consider herbs to be whole foods, because again, you're using the whole substance. So those are the ways that herbs are processed, and the ways that the body is going to use them, and the ways that I think it's important to understand what you're trying to accomplish in order to be able to get the most effect from them. Again, with the alcohol, you can use them topically. So something like lobelia that people might take internally because it does help to relax spasms and remove obstructions in the body, would find that topically it's also very effective at taking spasms out, cramps and that kind of thing, and carried through the skin with the alcohol, it's very effective that way. So I want to move on and spend a little time covering some of the other forms of alternative health care, because most people, when they start with herbs, that works and they think that's cool, and so they move on from there a little bit further. One other note on herbs is that it's always best, with very few exceptions, to take the herbs with your meals, because they're foods, right? So when you're smelling food and tasting food, you're going to have the highest level of digestive activity. Those tastes and smells are going to trigger the production of enzymes and so forth, so you're going to have a greater capacity to utilize the nutrients in those herbs or those supplemental foods by taking them when you're eating a regular meal. The exception to that is one of the craze herbs, which is the barley greens or the barley powder or the green whatever. There's 18 different labels out there, I'm sure, of greens, supplemental greens. And the greens by themselves, the chlorophyll supplements, tend to be very, very alkaline in the body. And so they will reduce the capacity of the body to break down, especially the proteins. So it's important that those be taken away from meals. Anytime I'm using barley greens powder or something like that as a supplement, I will always encourage people to eat those separately from a meal, at least 30 minutes away, and to take them with some form of something acidic to get them into the body, because people who drink chlorophyll with their meals or whatever are actually reducing the stomach's capacity to break down the foods that it's going to be taking in. And that's why I think it comes back again to you educating yourselves. Most of you would not walk into a supermarket and say, I'm having this really important dinner party this weekend. Could you tell me what to serve? And trust whatever they said, And yet people will walk into a health food store all the time and say, I've had this whatever, and can you tell me what to take? And they do it. And those are very often, the same minimum wage employees that would be stocking the shelf at a supermarket are stocking the shelf at a health food store. And yet because they work in a health food store, you assume that they know something about health. And so it's just not always going to work. And I caution people not to do that, because the golden seal that I mentioned that would lower blood sugar is excellent. And for a while it was, the herb of the month or whatever. And everybody was supposed to take golden seal for everything all the time. And golden seal in the body tends to lose its effectiveness after a period of time, after about 2 or 3 weeks. So I save golden seal personally for the really big guns, because I know it is effective as an antibiotic against certain types of bacteria. I want it to work when I need it for that. And I don't want to be taking it all the time. In America, the vast majority of our people are borderline hypoglycemic because of the huge amount of sugar intake. And so someone who's taking lots of golden seal because they just think that's supposed to be good for your body to take lots of golden seal, which can reduce blood sugar, do you see how they could start feeling real tired if their blood sugar keeps dropping and they're already hypoglycemic? So you want to find the information that you need responsibly. Take that information from sources that you believe to be reliable, and look it up for yourselves. Don't just trust the stock clerks in the supermarket or the health food store or wherever, okay? The other forms of things, though, tend to follow after that, and people start looking for other ways. Since the herbs work and so forth, they start expanding a little bit. And some of the other things that most people are looking at right now are things like homeopathy. Homeopathic remedies are not new. They've definitely come into favor of late, but they have been the primary medical system in Europe for years and years and years. It was originally developed in the 1800s by Samuel Hahnemann. Actually, Americans are giving Samuel Hahnemann credit. The Western concept of homeopathy is Samuel Hahnemann's. Ayurvedic medicine has used similar concepts for over 4,000 years. And so it's not a new concept. But the principle behind homeopathy is that very small amounts of something can trigger the body to have very strong reactions. At the tangible level, you see something like quinine, which when you take quinine as a healthy person will cause you to have nausea and diarrhea and sometimes chills and tremors and so forth, is the drug or the treatment of choice for malaria. And the symptoms of malaria are nausea and diarrhea and tremors and shakes and all the things that quinine would cause in a healthy person. It will alleviate in a person who has those symptoms. Homeopathic remedies work on an electrical principle. Okay, they capture their extremely dilute amounts, like 1 part in 10,000 of something, but they're prepared in a way with vibration that causes them to retain the electrical frequency of that particular substance. Now, when we're talking about muscle response testing, we're talking about checking and working with the electrical circuitry in the body. And the whole class on muscle testing, the last class that we're doing, is going to teach you how to do your own muscle testing for your family and so forth. But the principle behind it is that everything in the universe is held together by electrical bonds, right? Remember your covalent ionic bonds and so forth? So everything is going to have a very unique electrical frequency to it based on that structure. And homeopathy magnifies that principle. It takes that electrical structure or electrical frequency and it captures it in water or in glycerin, whatever the base substance is. Usually it's water. And it's that vibration then taken into the body acts very much like a tuning fork would act. And you know, if you hit a G fork in a room, anything that's tuned to G is going to begin to vibrate by the stimulus of that fork. And so that's the principle that's in the body. If you have one frequency that's not quite working right, that taking that frequency in of the particular substance helps to stabilize that frequency and addresses the symptoms. Homeopathic medicines are recognized in this country as over-the-counter remedies. And so you'll see remedies for diarrhea, for injuries, for asthma, for allergies, for rashes. And they all are recognized as homeopathic remedies. Remedy meaning a treatment for a disease, a self-limiting condition is the requirement for an over-the-counter remedy. The initial pharmacopoeia of the United States, the book that listed all of the remedies, was a homeopathic pharmacopoeia. I was really amused when we went to the movie Little Women. It was really fun to me to watch that because if you remember in the story, the one daughter became very, very ill. She had scarlet fever, I think. And so all of the daughters were sitting around her, and the doctor was finally called in. But while the daughters were sitting there, they're thumbing through this book, and one of the girls says, "No, she looks more like Belladonna to me." And that's what they were flipping through, was a pharmacopoeia, a homeopathic pharmacopoeia, trying to figure out which remedy to use, okay? And so they tried the belladonna or whatever, and they had not come to the right conclusion or didn't have the right substance or whatever. She did not get better. The doctor, finally, the rich neighbor next door, sent his physician in, and the physician looked at her and said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do." And then Marmee comes home, and she rushes in, and she sees her. And do you remember what she did? The first thing she did was she touched the girl's head, and she was, of course, burning with fever. She flipped the covers off of her feet and felt her feet, and she says, "We've got to pull the fever out of her head. Boil me some water." And she got her feet into hot water. So we're working with the body here. What's happening? All the circulation is locked. Everything was in the upper part of the body, and she wanted to pull it down, increase the circulation in the whole body, get that fever broken, and so forth. And so the girl, of course, recovered, and that was all based on the true experiences of Joe, who wrote the books. The homeopathic remedies have been around in this country for over 150 years, and they've been widely recognized throughout that time as being very valid. The principle, when they were first developing them, Hahnemann said that the primary medical treatments at the time were things like arsenic and cadmium, and they would bleed people and all these other things. And Dr. Hahnemann said to him, he was trained as a medical doctor, and he said that it did not make sense to him that which would or Samuel Thompson, one of the counterparts in this country at that time, said it did not make sense to him that what would kill a well rat could cure a sick man. And so that was the premise that we were all working on with our pharmaceuticals at the time, and Hahnemann and his contemporaries just thought that did not quite sound right. And so the homeopathic medicines became very much in use and are still used extensively throughout Europe today and are becoming very much common today. The nice thing about a homeopathic remedy is that it is a quick remedy right now. David's grandmother has severe allergy attacks. that have hospitalized her repeatedly. And she said that if she takes the allergy homeopathic, as soon as she feels her throat starting to close, that the symptoms go away. And she doesn't have that anymore. And we had a guy at church that had poison ivy, all over his face. His eyes were swelled shut, and he'd been that way for about 4 days. And we gave him the rash homeopathic, which has the poison ivy remedy. And in less than 24 hours, it was gone. And so I've seen remarkable results. I have taken that principle one step further and gone the Ayurvedic route with homeopathics, which is to take the offending substance and make my own homeopathic remedies very, very effectively. This is going to sound ludicrous to some of you, but my little boy, we figured out he was allergic to rodents. We'd had rabbits, and he got this funny little rash on his elbows, just not blisters or anything, just little bumps, real rough bumps everywhere. And, nothing seemed to really take care of it, and I couldn't figure out what was the deal, and I tried a couple of different homeopathic remedies, and I finally thought, okay, we're going to the principle of like cures like to its purest extent, and this is the way the Ayurvedics have done it. I took a sterile needle and I just scratched over the surface of the bumps, okay, and put it into water and prepared it homeopathically in several dilutions and so forth. 24 hours, the bumps were gone. And I thought, oh, that was fun, and just kind of thought it was a fluke. Well, we ended up getting rid of the rabbits and so forth. Well, Aaron got a gerbil for his birthday, and I never really was sure that that's what had caused these bumps. 2 days after we got the gerbil, Aaron got bumps on his elbows again. So I prepared the remedy again, and we did the same thing again. And what's wonderful to me with that is that they've stayed gone. It stabilized whatever it was in his body that was overreacting, and so we haven't had to deal with the bumps anymore. He's still got the gerbil, and the bumps are gone. And so there are ways to use the principle very much to be effective in dealing with things right now. There are homeopathic remedies for fevers and for diarrheas and so forth. And for children, they're usually prepared with glycerin so that you can give it to them without having to worry about an overdose. If you were to take an entire bottle of homeopathic anything and feed it to your child, it would do nothing. If you took it and you didn't need it, chemically, a homeopathic remedy is water and sometimes alcohol, which is used as a preserving agent, or glycerin, used as a preserving agent. But there is nothing chemical there, so your child or yourself could take bottles full of the stuff, and it would be ineffective at best, or at worst. It's not going to hurt anyone. It's impossible to overdose at a homeopathic remedy that's an over-the-counter form. So that's a nice thing to know that you've got, and that's a quickie. Now, I always combine herbs and homeopathics. And the reason that I do that is that if I've got a cramp, and I take homeopathic Calphos or something, that would alleviate the cramp, but the magnesium deficiency that caused that muscle to grab up in the first place would not have been addressed. So I'm going to get a cramp again, and I'm going to have to take the homeopathic remedy for the cramp again. And so if we can go in and structurally support the body, give it the magnesium that it needs, the cramp homeopathic is wonderful to take the cramp out right now, but it's nice to know then that you can build the body so that you're not going to keep having that problem recur. And that's true with whatever. If it's a constipation remedy, I will always give someone some bowel build or something to support the bowel and strengthen that muscle at the same time so that you don't have to keep relying on any kind of a remedy. Even though homeopathics are not harmful, again, I don't believe we should have to be constantly remedying problems. We should be structurally sound and not have those problems coming up all the time. The last couple of things that I want to touch on are some of the fun things. Some people that are familiar with homeopathy are also familiar with the flower remedies or flower essences. Most people first are familiar with the work of Dr. Bach, and they've seen the Bach remedies, which are 39 flower remedies. And the flower remedies are prepared on homeopathic principle, although the process is a little bit different, from the blossoms of certain flowers or certain plants. Now, the principle behind homeopathy is that you're working on an electrical frequency, right, and stabilizing that frequency in the body. And so that's valid for physical things, physical feelings, pains, and so forth. But it's also valid at other levels, because any time that you have a feeling, a thought, whatever, it's still an electrical frequency, isn't it? The brain sends out a stimulus, and there is a thought wave or a feeling, whatever, frequency. And the flower essences are designed specifically to address the emotional frequencies and help stabilize emotional issues. I work with the Bach remedies, but I also work more with the North American flower remedies. I find that we tend to respond better as a rule because we seem to have a greater affinity for North American plants, being that we are North American. Bach used many of the same types of plants. For example, one of the Bach remedies is called mimulus. and mimulus, the mimulus family or the monkey flower family. I also use pink monkey flower and scarlet monkey flower and several other flower remedies in conjunction with that. And when I'm muscle testing people, most people are going to test for one of the North American remedies as opposed to the British species, just because apparently those are the nutritional things and so forth that are familiar to us. The structure of those plants is determined, of course, by where they're grown, and we're close to those. Aromatherapy works with fragrance. Flower essences do not have a smell. They're homeopathic preparations, again, with water. But aromatherapy is using aromatic oils, and it triggers certain functions in the body or in the brain. Now, you can use, using like the Thai oils that I put on someone's shoulder that was sore are aromatic, and they stimulate the circulation. The aromatherapy tends to stimulate certain areas of the brain. And if you think about it, when you smell cinnamon, how do you feel? Home, safe, warm. The smell brings back a certain connotation. Certain other odors have different connotations. And so those triggers in the brain and so forth tend to impact which organs are going to be affected by aromatherapy and which feelings are going to be impacted by them. So you can see that there is definitely a lot to learn, and we don't want you walking away from here thinking, oh my gosh, I'll never know it all. But if you can take it a step at a time, you can see that there are a lot of different options out there and a lot of ways to address anything that's happening in the body. My first choice will always be to support the body structurally, to support it with foods and to support it with supplemental foods. My second choice would be to go with some kind of an over-the-counter remedy. The aromatherapy and the flower essences especially address emotional issues, which is another whole workshop. I do a 2-day workshop on that because the more I have learned, the more I have seen how many emotional impacted people we have out there where the physical condition will not improve until the emotional state is addressed or alleviated. And so, the laughter with the man with cancer is probably the simplest example that we have. But we have to have those other things going on in the body also. We need to be well-rounded. We need to have our breathing. We need to have our good foods. We need to have our chimneys open. We need to be happy people. We need to be well-balanced spiritually and emotionally. We need to have love from each other. All of those things together is what constitutes health. I don't believe that health is just not being sick. And for most people, that's where we start. Well, if I can just not be sick, I'll be happy. And it's nice to know that we have these things and that they can help with that stage. But hopefully we can also take it a step beyond that, and we can get to wellness, where we feel wonderful. What's real exciting to me is when I'll have a client who comes just out of curiosity for a consultation. It's not that they have any particular health issue they're working on. They're just curious, My neighbor came to you and thought this weird stuff that you did was cool, and so I just wanted to see what you did. And they'll come back 3 weeks later for their checkup, and they'll say, I didn't know I felt so bad. Because we've come as a culture to accept that it's normal to be tired all the time, and it's normal to have headaches, and it's normal just to sort of be achy and miserable, and to have all of these other things happening to us, and to need to go to the doctor once a month for a medication. It's not normal. We were designed to do good works, and we can't do those if we're sick. We were designed to have joy in our existence, and we don't feel that if we're sick. And I think that as we learn and we grow, we come to an awareness that we can be a lot more in control of that than we've ever believed, that we can be responsible for our health. And hopefully you've learned things tonight that you can take home and use right now. You don't have to wait for another expert. You don't have to wait for another book or for time to listen or read one. You can go home tonight and make a difference, one step at a time. And the thing I want everyone to realize is to do it from that angle, okay? Most people are not going to go home and turn their whole life around. And it doesn't mean you can't be healthy if you're not willing to do everything right now. It means that you can get better. And to me, that's the most important thing that we're striving for here, is to teach people how to get better. Better is a progressive statement. Okay, I didn't say best. One step at a time, you get better. And when you take one step, you find that the next one gets easier. Everyone knows what you're not supposed to be eating. I'd rather have you worry about what you are supposed to be and adding those things in instead of worrying with the fear and the panic of how to avoid all of those things. Go out and take a positive step. Go home and don't buy any more iceberg lettuce. Go home and take a deep breath. Go home and drink a good glass of water. And those are steps you can take to make a difference, and that will make all of this worthwhile. That's the third leg on your stool. and that means that you've completed the cycle and that you've made a step in the right direction. And that's the challenge that I have to you. Thanks.